What if I told you a single island, smaller than the state of Oregon, once controlled over 400 million people across the globe, that it ruled continents, redrew borders, rewrote languages, and changed the course of history more than any other empire before it? This isn't fiction. This was the British Empire. Tonight, we're not just recounting history, we're unraveling a world-altering force that shaped the modern age, from the misty highlands of Scotland to the spice-laden markets of India, from battles fought on icy seas to quiet revolutions whispered in jungle villages. Every corner of this empire holds a secret, some awe-inspiring, some unsettling, all of them fascinating. As you relax and drift off, you'll discover how a naval obsession turned into global domination, how everyday items like tea and rubber carry legacies of conquest, and why so many of today's conflicts, cultures and countries trace their roots back to a flag that once flew over a quarter of the earth. This is the story of power, ambition, resistance, and legacy. This is the British Empire, like you've never heard it before. And like many great stories, it begins slowly. Long before its red stripes stretched across the globe, the British Isles were a patchwork of tribal kingdoms and shifting identities. The land was shaped by conquest, Roman roads, Viking raids, Norman rulers, and each wave left its own quiet influence. England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland would form the uneasy core of what would later become the United Kingdom, but for centuries they were fractured, at times warring, at times merging, always evolving. There was no grand plan for empire in those early days, no map stretched out before kings and queens. Instead, the foundations of empire were built gradually, out of necessity, ambition, curiosity, and chance. As the medieval world gave way to the early modern era, change was stirring across Europe. The Renaissance brought a rebirth of ideas, while the Reformation fractured religious unity. But more than anything, it was the lure of the sea that changed everything. From Spain to Portugal, from the Netherlands to France, the nations of Europe began looking outward, not just with curiosity, but with intention. New continents had been reached, new trade routes discovered, and new resources encountered. Oceans that once served as barriers were becoming bridges. In this age of sails and stars, England entered the global stage cautiously, yet with growing ambition. Though smaller and less wealthy than its rivals, it was a nation with a restless maritime spirit. In the late 15th century, explorers like John Cabot sailed westward, seeking passages to Asia. While their discoveries were modest compared to the conquests of Spain or the trade riches of the Portuguese, they marked the beginning of an outward gaze. By the time Elizabeth I reigned, that gaze had become a vision. Privateers like Sir Francis Drake and Sir Walter Raleigh would blend piracy with exploration, their expeditions sanctioned in part by royal charters. Ships were loaded with dreams of gold, spices, and prestige. The early voyages were bold but unpredictable, often ending in shipwreck or failure. Yet each journey added a thread to a growing web of maritime knowledge, each chart drawn becoming more precise, each captain returning with stories of foreign lands, unfamiliar peoples, and new possibilities. As the 17th century unfolded, England began to institutionalize its ambitions. Trade became formalized. Colonization became strategy. The East India Company, founded in 1600, was one of the most powerful engines of empire ever created. At first, it was a company like any other, seeking profit, trading goods, forging connections. But over time, it took on roles far beyond its charter. In India and Southeast Asia, it negotiated treaties, built forts, raised armies, and governed territory. It operated not only as a commercial venture, but as a de facto sovereign power. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, England established its first lasting footholds in the Americas. Jamestown in Virginia became a precarious settlement in 1607. The Pilgrims landed in Massachusetts 13 years later. Sugar plantations began to reshape the Caribbean. Colonies emerged one by one, small struggling communities that gradually grew into bustling towns and economies. These early territories were not yet the empire we imagine today, but they were its seedlings, fragile yet determined, shaped by the harsh conditions of frontier life and the deeply rooted structures of exploitation. The transatlantic slave trade, already well underway, became intertwined with Britain's expanding interests. Enslaved Africans were forcibly transported to labor on plantations in the Caribbean and the American South, producing sugar, tobacco, and cotton for European markets. It was a grim and dehumanizing system that would generate immense wealth for some, while inflicting generations of suffering on others. This darker undercurrent ran alongside the rise of British influence, a reminder that the empire's gleam was often built atop pain. Back in Britain, the wheels of expansion were turning in quieter ways. Port cities like Bristol, Liverpool, and London thrived on commerce. Merchants, bankers, insurers, and shipbuilders formed a new class of imperial middlemen, profiting not through conquest, but through cargo. Coffee houses became hubs of global gossip, where news from Jamaica or Bengal arrived alongside ships' manifests and exotic spices. The Royal Navy grew stronger with each passing year, enforcing order, projecting power, and safeguarding trade. By the early 18th century, the British Empire was no longer a distant dream but a visible structure. It had outposts in North America, the Caribbean, Africa, and Asia. It had trading routes that circled the globe, and most importantly, it had momentum. The empire was not a monolith. It was patchwork, uneven, full of contradictions. But it was growing, and its quiet rhythm of expansion, through commerce, coercion, and cultural influence, was reshaping the world. And so, with sails full and ledgers open, Britain's journey into empire had begun. Not in a single moment, but over decades of movement, slow, strategic, and often unseen by those living through it. What had once been a small island on the edge of Europe was becoming something far more complex, a global force whose legacy we still live with today. Let your mind rest here for a moment, gently drifting in the calm before the storm of industrial might, as we prepare to journey deeper into the heart of the British Empire, where the sun never set and the stories never stopped. By the dawn of the 18th century, the British Empire was no longer a scattering of distant outposts. It was becoming a system, a rhythm, a soft yet sweeping presence that quietly linked continents through trade, language, law, and labor. Its shape was not always defined by territory alone, but by its ability to reach into people's lives in ways that were often invisible. To sail a ship from London to Calcutta, to inscribe contracts in English on Caribbean shores, to regulate weights, measures, tariffs, and time, these were not the loud moments of empire, they were its heartbeat. Across the oceans, the British presence was stitched together by ports, those busy in-between spaces where goods met customs officers, sailors met merchants, and local traditions met foreign rules. From Halifax to Cape Coast, from Madras to Melbourne, harbors buzzed with activity. The sound of ropes creaking on wooden masts, of languages mingling on docks, of carts rolling over cobblestone, all carried the unseen hum of empire. These were not merely places of arrival and departure, they were the lifelines of imperial continuity, each one linking back to the island nation thousands of miles away. Trade was the empire's circulatory system. It flowed constantly, silently, reshaping both the colonies and the metropole. British merchants dealt not only in goods, but in systems, insurance to protect cargo, credit to fund expeditions, and elaborate networks of correspondence to manage it all. Raw materials like cotton, sugar, tobacco, tea, coffee, indigo, and rubber were extracted from colonies, shipped to Britain, processed in factories, and then sold back into colonial markets. The cycle fed itself, each link reinforcing the next. But this economy was not only built on cargo, it was built on people. Millions were uprooted and displaced through the transatlantic slave trade, a deeply tragic and brutal chapter that powered much of the early wealth of the empire. British ships played a central role in the triangular trade, transporting enslaved Africans to the Americas, carrying plantation products to Europe, and sending finished goods to Africa. The profits fueled grand estates, public buildings, and financial institutions back home, embedding the benefits of empire into everyday British life, even as the suffering it caused was largely hidden from public view. At the same time, another kind of movement was underway, one less brutal, but still profound. People migrated voluntarily, driven by opportunity, ambition, or necessity. Convicts were shipped to Australia, settlers moved to Canada, South Africa, and the Caribbean. Missionaries ventured abroad to spread religion. Civil servants, soldiers, and traders took up posts in distant colonies, bringing with them customs, books, and letters from home. In their trunks, they carried both material culture and ideology, planting schools, churches, cricket fields, and English-language newspapers in unfamiliar soils. In many places, the empire did not impose itself all at once. It arrived gently, almost imperceptibly, through architecture, taxation, education, and governance. A new courthouse here, a rail depot there. Over time, British systems of administration crept into everyday life. Local leaders were often retained, but their authority was slowly reframed through colonial law. Indigenous systems of knowledge and governance were sometimes co-opted, sometimes replaced. In schools, children learned to read in English, recite the names of kings, and measure in inches and feet. These small, steady changes helped ensure that the empire could operate across vastly different cultures and geographies, not through constant warfare, but through layered influence. Cultural exchange also traveled in both directions. While Britain exported its language, religion, and political models, it absorbed elements from its colonies as well, sometimes eagerly, often unknowingly. Indian textiles became fashionable in London. Caribbean rhythms found their way into British music. Botanical specimens from Africa and Asia were cultivated in English gardens. Words like bungalow, shampoo, pajamas, and lute entered the English language, each one quietly carrying the story of contact and transformation. Perhaps the most emblematic symbol of this entangled world was tea. Once an exotic luxury, it became a daily ritual. But every cup of tea represented a vast chain of production and power, cultivated in India or China, transported on ships, taxed by governments, stirred with sugar grown on Caribbean plantations, and consumed in porcelain imported from the East. Something as simple as an afternoon habit was, in truth, the product of imperial design. In the background, the Royal Navy stood as the quiet enforcer of order. Not always at war, but always present, it patrolled trade routes, deterred piracy, enforced blockades, and protected British interests wherever they were challenged. Naval bases dotted the map like stepping stones: Gibraltar, Malta, Singapore, and beyond, ensuring that British ships could refuel, repair, and resume their endless circuits around the globe. Control of the seas allowed Britain to operate its empire with speed, confidence, and reach far beyond what land armies alone could achieve. As the 18th century matured, The empire's economic and administrative reach deepened. While wars still played a role, particularly with rival empires like France and Spain, the real power of Britain lay in its ability to organize, to write laws, to set clocks, to define borders on maps that had never before needed them. The empire became a framework that made the unfamiliar legible to its administrators, and often profitable. Yet in all of this, the British Empire was not a single entity. It was a mosaic. No two colonies were quite alike. Some were settler-dominated and self-governing. Others were governed directly from London. Some welcomed British presence, others resisted it fiercely, and in each place, local histories, cultures and environments shaped how empire was received, resisted, or reimagined. As we gently turn toward the next chapter in our journey, the empire stands poised for even greater expansion. The Industrial Revolution looms on the horizon, bringing with it machines, factories, steamships, and telegraphs. And with those tools, Britain would reshape the very pace of the world, making time move faster, distances feel shorter, and control more complete. But for now, rest in this moment, when sails still guided ships across oceans, and empires moved at the speed of wind and will. The machinery of empire was quietly humming, and its rhythm could be heard from Bengal to Barbados, from Sierra Leone to Singapore. As the 19th century dawned, a quiet but profound shift began to stir within the British Empire. The sounds of creaking masts and lapping waves had long defined its rhythm, but now a new cadence emerged, the steady churning of machinery, the hiss of steam, the clatter of iron wheels on tracks. The Industrial Revolution, born in Britain's workshops and coalfields, would not remain confined to the island. It would become the empire's new engine, transforming how it moved, governed, and imagined the world. In the cold, dark towns of northern England, factories rose like iron cathedrals. Manchester, Birmingham, Leeds, these were no longer merely cities, but production centers humming with mechanized labor. Raw materials flowed in from across the empire, fueling a system that turned cotton into cloth, ore into tools, and invention into empire. British textiles, mass-produced in mills powered by steam, flooded colonial markets. In India, where handloom weavers had once crafted fine muslins and silks, local industries withered under the weight of cheap imports. It was not a war fought with muskets, but with markets, and in many places it proved just as transformative. Steamships replaced sailboats, shrinking oceans and tightening the grip of imperial logistics. The voyage from Britain to India, once a months-long affair, could now be completed in mere weeks. Canals like the Suez, opened in 1869, carved shortcuts through the world's geography, making distant colonies feel closer, more manageable, more real. Railways extended this transformation inland. Across India, Africa, and Southeast Asia, iron tracks wound through jungles and deserts, connecting ports to plantations, mines to markets. Though often celebrated as symbols of progress, these lines were drawn not for local benefit, but for imperial efficiency, moving goods, soldiers, and administrators with clinical precision. Communication, too, was reimagined. The electric telegraph strung its wires across oceans and continents, allowing news to travel from Bombay to London in moments rather than months. For the first time in history, a single government could issue orders from the metropole and expect near-instant responses from halfway across the globe. Decisions about war, trade, or diplomacy no longer had to wait for the wind. The empire's arteries now pulsed with the beat of electric current, binding its far-flung parts into something newly alive or newly entangled. This period also saw a change in how the empire understood itself. Where earlier generations had justified expansion through commerce, profit, or prestige, the Victorian age began to speak of moral purpose. The empire, it was claimed, had a duty to civilize, to bring law, order, and enlightenment to the world's so-called darker corners. Missionaries, school teachers, and reformers fanned out across the colonies, bringing with them not only religion and education, but also British ideals of propriety, discipline, and hierarchy. This civilizing mission, while sincere for some, masked deeper truths. It often served as a justification for control, a reason to reshape societies in Britain's image, even when those societies had their own rich traditions and wisdoms. Queen Victoria, crowned Empress of India in 1876, became the symbolic figurehead of this sprawling dominion. Her reign, long and stable, gave the empire a sense of permanence, even inevitability. Under her rule, Britain reached the height of its imperial power, not just in landmass, but in confidence. Maps were printed in classrooms with vast stretches of pink marking British territory. School children recited patriotic poems, their verses echoing in marble halls and village schools alike. Empire became not just policy, but identity, a lens through which many Britons viewed the world and themselves. Yet beneath this surface of grandeur, tensions brewed. Industrialization brought not only wealth, but inequality. In Britain itself, cities swelled with workers who toiled in harsh conditions, their lives far removed from the stately images of empire. In the colonies, resentment simmered beneath the reforms and railways. Local economies had been redirected to serve distant markets. Cultural practices had been dismissed or criminalized. Resistance, subtle or open, grew in many corners. The empire's grip was strong, but it was not unchallenged. Still, for much of the 19th century, the empire projected an image of unstoppable ascent. Its flags flew on every continent. Its goods filled every market. Its laws shaped foreign courts, and its language echoed in port cities from Cape Town to Hong Kong. It was, in many ways, the first truly global system, a network of power, production, and people woven together not by consent, but by command. And yet, for all its reach, the empire remained haunted by contradiction. It spoke of freedom while denying self-rule. It praised progress while clinging to hierarchy. It offered protection while extracting resources. These paradoxes would not unravel all at once, but their threads were already fraying. As we drift further into the 19th century, we begin to see the empire not as a single story, but as a tapestry, complex, layered, often contradictory. It was an empire of steam and scripture, of violence and vision, of railways and revolts. And like all things built by human hands, it would one day begin to crack. But for now, let the engines grow quiet in your mind. Let the smoke of coal fade gently into mist. The British Empire, at the height of its industrial might, stands vast and assured, its shadows long, its influence deep. And beyond the horizon, new forces are stirring. Ideas of liberty, nationalism, and resistance are beginning to take shape. We will follow them soon, but not just yet. By the mid-19th century, the British Empire stood taller than ever before. Its dominions spanned continents, its ships ruled the seas, and its industries hummed with wealth drawn from every corner of the world. But empires, like tides, are never still. Beneath the gleaming surface of progress and order, deeper currents of unrest began to stir, slow at first, then gathering force, as people across the empire began to question the very foundations of British rule. In India, the jewel of the empire, one such tremor grew into a wave. The year was 1857, and what began as a mutiny among sepoys, Indian soldiers employed by the British East India Company, soon blossomed into a widespread uprising, sparked by grievances both old and new, from disrespect to religious practices to economic hardship and loss of land. The rebellion was not merely a protest against a single offense. It was an eruption of long-simmering discontent. Towns and regions rose in defiance, challenging not just policies, but the entire machinery of colonial control. Though the British eventually quelled the revolt, it left an indelible mark. The East India Company, whose private armies and commercial ambitions had once built Britain's foothold in the subcontinent, was dissolved. In its place, the British Crown assumed direct control over India, marking a new chapter in imperial governance. A more formal colonial administration was put in place, with viceroys and civil servants dispatched to manage the land and its people. Railroads expanded, telegraph lines multiplied, but so too did surveillance, censorship, and the tightening grip of control. India was no longer just a possession, it was a symbol, a central axis of Britain's global might, and a place where the tensions of rule would continue to build. Elsewhere in the empire, echoes of discontent could also be heard. In Africa, as British influence crept further inland from coastal trading posts, friction with indigenous kingdoms became more frequent. The Zulu kingdom in southern Africa, proud and militarily formidable, resisted encroachment in the 1870s. In West Africa, Asante resistance flared in present-day Ghana. These conflicts were not yet large-scale wars of independence, but they were signs of an empire meeting limits drawn by cultures, communities, and leaders unwilling to be absorbed without resistance. Even within settler colonies, where British migrants formed significant populations, tensions flickered. In places like Australia and Canada, questions of autonomy began to arise. These regions were largely governed by British law and culture, but as they matured, many settlers pushed for more self-rule. Gradually, systems of responsible government emerged, offering white colonists increasing say over local affairs, a privilege not extended to indigenous populations whose lands and rights were steadily eroded through policy and expansion. The empire's internal contradictions became increasingly visible. It championed progress, yet maintained systems of racial and economic inequality. It spoke of civilization, yet deployed violence to suppress dissent. It promised unity, yet enforced hierarchy. And as literacy rose and global communication improved, these tensions were not so easily contained. Newspapers, pamphlets, and conversations spread not just imperial messages, but also ideas of justice, self-determination, and reform. Back in Britain, the empire continued to cast a long shadow. Public exhibitions showcased colonial artifacts, animals, and even people, presenting empire as a spectacle of wonder and control. Yet the very need to display dominion hinted at anxiety, a desire to reinforce a narrative that, deep down, felt fragile. Debates raged in Parliament and the press about the costs and benefits of empire. Reformers criticized colonial abuses. Philosophers and poets questioned the morality of conquest. While many still believed in Britain's imperial destiny, others began to see the human toll beneath the triumphs. In this era, the idea of British superiority, racial, cultural, and moral, was often used to justify continued expansion. But the world was changing. The same forces that enabled empire, industry, science, global networks, also empowered those who opposed it. Educated elites in colonized nations began to voice new arguments. Writers and thinkers emerged in India, Egypt, the Caribbean, and beyond, blending local traditions with Western ideas to demand dignity, representation, and eventually independence. The seeds of modern nationalism were being planted, nurtured quietly in classrooms, courtrooms, and street corners. Still, the empire pressed on. Its administrators built new schools and court systems, mapped unknown regions, and codified local customs into colonial law. Infrastructure projects, dams, ports, telegraph lines, multiplied, but many of these were designed not for local benefit, but for extraction and control. In Kenya, coffee and tea plantations took root on fertile land. In Malaya, tin and rubber were harvested for global markets. In Egypt, the control of the Suez Canal became a strategic priority. Empire had become not just a possession, but a system, integrated, calculated, and increasingly impersonal. And through it all, the people of the empire lived their lives, some adapting, others resisting, many caught in the quiet spaces in between. They farmed, taught, worshipped, traded, mourned, and hoped. For many, empire was not a faraway institution, but a daily presence, in the taxes they paid, the languages they spoke, the clothes they wore, and the choices available to them. It shaped their world, often without asking. As the century turned toward its final decades, the British Empire appeared stronger than ever. But beneath its vast surface, the first fractures were forming. The idea of empire was beginning to be questioned not just by outsiders, but by those within, both in Britain and across the colonies. And as the 20th century approached, bringing with it new ideologies, new wars, and new aspirations, the empire would face challenges unlike any it had seen before. Let your mind wander now across this wide and shifting landscape, through markets in Cairo, classrooms in Calcutta, and valleys in New Zealand. The empire is still firm, but the ground beneath it is shifting. The next chapter awaits. As the sun rose on the 20th century, the British Empire was at its territorial height. A quarter of the Earth's land and people lived under its domain, from the icy reaches of Canada to the tropical forests of Southeast Asia. Its influence stretched seemingly without end. It controlled trade routes, set time zones, and dictated policy across a mosaic of colonies, protectorates, and dominions. It was, by appearance, unshakable, but history, like the tides, has a way of testing such illusions. And the first great test came not from rebellion within, but from war without. In 1914, Europe plunged into the First World War, a conflict whose scale and devastation had no precedent. Britain, bound by alliances and imperial obligations, entered the war with a vast network at its disposal. It mobilized not only its army and navy, but the resources of its empire. From India came over 1 million troops, Sikh, Muslim, and Hindu soldiers marching under the Union Jack, fighting in foreign lands for a crown that was not their own. From Africa, the Caribbean, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand came men and material, shipped across oceans to serve in muddy trenches, on windswept battlefields, and aboard armored convoys. The war bound the empire together in new and intense ways. Postal systems carried letters between distant families. Newspapers printed dispatches from the front. Colonial administrators coordinated supply chains, and economies reoriented toward the demands of war. But unity did not mean equality. Colonial soldiers often received lower pay, fewer honors, and harsher conditions than their British counterparts. And when the war ended, with staggering loss of life and shifting political borders, many who had served returned home to find the empire unchanged, their sacrifices acknowledged, but not rewarded with freedom or self-rule. The post-war years brought with them both reflection and unrest. In India, the return of soldiers coincided with a growing nationalist movement. Mahatma Gandhi, once a quiet lawyer, emerged as a central figure of resistance. Through non-violent protest, he and others began to challenge British authority, not with weapons, but with marches, boycotts, and strikes. The massacre at Amritsar in 1919, where British troops fired upon unarmed civilians, shocked the conscience of the world and hardened Indian resolve. Calls for independence grew louder, more organized, and more impossible to ignore. Elsewhere, the mood was similarly unsettled. In Ireland, the long-standing tensions between British rule and Irish nationalism erupted into revolution. After years of political struggle and violent clashes, the Irish Free State was established in 1922, marking one of the first major contractions of the empire. Though Northern Ireland remained part of the United Kingdom, the loss of most of the island was a powerful reminder that even the most established parts of the empire were not immune to change. In the Middle East, new territories came under British control following the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. Mandates in Palestine, Iraq, and Transjordan were administered in the name of international responsibility, but they bore the familiar hallmarks of imperial ambition. Boundaries were drawn, sometimes arbitrarily. Promises were made to different groups, often conflicting ones. The seeds of future conflict were quietly planted in the desert winds, even as British officials spoke of order and development. Meanwhile, in Africa and the Caribbean, frustrations mounted over political exclusion and economic hardship. Colonial economies had been disrupted by the war, and many regions were left struggling to recover. The wealth of empire, so often drawn from these lands, seemed to flow only in one direction. Local leaders and intellectuals began to speak out, founding newspapers, labor unions, and political parties. These were the early echoes of movements that would decades later demand full liberation. The interwar period saw the British Empire enter a strange kind of limbo, still powerful but increasingly defensive. It doubled down on control in some areas, while experimenting with limited reforms in others. White settler colonies like Canada, Australia, South Africa, and New Zealand were granted increasing autonomy through the Statute of Westminster in 1931, solidifying their status as self-governing dominions. But for the vast majority of subjects elsewhere, real political power remained distant. Then, in 1939, another war engulfed the world. The Second World War would prove even more far-reaching than the first, testing the empire's resources, resilience, and relevance. Once again, the colonies rallied. Troops from across the empire fought in Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific. Supplies flowed across oceans, intelligence networks spanned continents, but the strain was immense. Britain itself suffered bombings, shortages, and a growing awareness that the war could not be won through imperial means alone. When victory finally came in 1945, it was hollowed by exhaustion. The cost of 2 world wars had drained Britain economically and emotionally. The United States and the Soviet Union emerged as superpowers, and the imperial model, based on control from afar, began to look increasingly outdated in a world seeking new ideologies and freedoms. The empire was still vast on paper, but its core had weakened, and in its farthest reaches, the will to remain under British rule was beginning to fade. The wars had changed more than borders. They had altered hearts, minds, and expectations. Veterans returned with new awareness. Colonial subjects who had fought beside Europeans, who had seen the wider world, began to ask hard questions. Why should they remain governed from afar? Why should their lands and labor continue to serve distant masters? The promise of democracy, so loudly proclaimed in wartime rhetoric, rang hollow under colonial rule. The stage was now set for something new. The British Empire, once described as the empire on which the sun never set, was preparing to enter its twilight. Not through collapse, but through a long, complex process of decolonization, marked by negotiation, struggle, and profound transformation. Rest now in this moment of quiet between storms. The guns have fallen silent. The maps still show British rule, but the world beneath them is no longer the same. A new era is beginning to form, one shaped not by conquest, but by the winding path toward independence. The years following the Second World War marked a turning point for the British Empire, not with a sudden crash, but with a quiet and complex unraveling. It was a process that would take decades, shaped by diplomacy, defiance, and determination. Where once the empire had expanded with apparent ease, it now began a long retreat. Yet, even in retreat, it left deep and lasting traces behind. The pressures were many. Britain's economy, weakened by years of war, could no longer sustain the costs of global governance. The moral authority of empire had been eroded by the rhetoric of freedom and democracy that filled wartime speeches. And across the colonies, people were no longer content with half measures or postponed promises. They had seen too much, endured too much, and waited too long. In India, the demand for independence had become undeniable. Years of civil disobedience, protest, and political negotiation had worn down British resolve. The country was vast, diverse, and deeply divided, especially along religious lines. Yet, even amid uncertainty and unrest, the call for freedom was louder than any force that could oppose it. On August 15, 1947, British rule in India formally ended. Two nations were born, India and Pakistan. The moment was one of celebration and sorrow, accompanied by partition, displacement, and violence. Millions crossed new borders in haste and fear. Yet, for all its tragedy, independence marked the beginning of a new era, the first major step in the dismantling of Britain's global dominion. India's departure signaled to other colonies that independence was not a distant dream, but a tangible reality. Across Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean, political movements gathered momentum. In Burma, Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, and Malaya, the path to sovereignty unfolded through negotiation and, in some cases, internal conflict. The Gold Coast in West Africa became Ghana in 1957, the first sub-Saharan African country to break free from colonial rule, led by Kwame Nkrumah, whose vision of Pan-Africanism resonated far beyond his nation's borders. In many cases, decolonization was a gradual process, managed through discussions, elections, and the transfer of administrative power, but not everywhere. In Kenya, the Mau Mau uprising challenged British rule with armed resistance. In Cyprus, nationalist movements demanded union with Greece, clashing with British forces. In Malaya, communist insurgents battled colonial authority in a drawn-out conflict known as the Emergency. These were not mere footnotes. They were sharp reminders that empire, even in its twilight, could still bleed. As one colony after another sought independence, Britain adapted its imperial stance. The language of rule shifted from command to cooperation. The idea of a commonwealth, a voluntary association of former colonies, took on new significance. Though its origins lay in earlier imperial structures, the post-war Commonwealth evolved into something more symbolic, a network of independent nations linked by shared history, mutual interest, and a willingness to remain connected even after formal empire had ended. Some viewed it as a remnant of British influence, others as a gesture of continuity and respect. Back home in Britain, the dismantling of empire sparked mixed emotions. For some, it was a necessary and just process, the righting of historical wrongs. For others, it was a source of nostalgia and loss. The idea of Britain as a world power, a guiding force in global affairs, was hard to relinquish. Politicians debated the nation's role in the post-imperial world. Citizens, too, felt the shift, as immigration from former colonies increased, and the once distant places of empire became part of everyday British life. Indeed, as the empire receded, its people did not disappear. From the Caribbean came the Windrush generation, helping rebuild Britain's war-torn cities. From South Asia, families settled in neighborhoods across the UK, bringing their cultures, cuisines and languages. From Africa came students, doctors, artists and laborers. The empire was gone in name, but its legacies remained, not just in monuments and maps, but in the very fabric of modern Britain. In the 1960s and 70s, the pace of decolonization quickened. Nigeria, Uganda, Zambia, and dozens of other African nations gained independence. The Caribbean saw new flags raised in Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, Barbados and beyond. In the Pacific, small island nations emerged from the long shadows of colonial rule, and with each new dawn, the world map changed, its colors shifting from imperial pink to the varied hues of sovereignty. Yet the end of empire did not mean the end of struggle. Newly independent nations faced enormous challenges: political instability, economic dependency, and the difficult task of nation building after generations of foreign control. Borders drawn by colonial hands often grouped together diverse communities or split apart cohesive ones. Infrastructure had been designed for extraction, not sustainability, and the weight of historical injustice lingered in education systems, in land ownership, in memory. Still, the spirit of self-determination could not be undone. Across the former empire, national identities blossomed. Local languages, once suppressed, were reclaimed. Cultural traditions were revived and reimagined. New literature, music, and art emerged, reflecting the complexities of post-colonial life. In universities and schools, students studied their own histories, not just those of their colonizers. And though the road was uneven, it was theirs to walk. For Britain, the imperial sunset brought both reflection and reinvention. It sought new roles as a member of the European Economic Community, as a global financial hub, and as a voice in international diplomacy. Yet even in this new age, the echoes of empire remained in foreign policy decisions, in debates over immigration, in the shape of cities, and the stories told in classrooms. As the 20th century drew to a close, the British Empire, once vast and dominant, had largely dissolved. Only a handful of overseas territories remained, scattered across the globe. But its legacy, intricate, contested, and enduring, continued to shape the modern world in countless ways. Rest here now, in the calm after the long unraveling. The flags have changed, but the history remains, woven into the lives of billions, across nations that once shared a single crown. The story of the British Empire is not only one of conquest and decline, but of resilience, reinvention, and enduring connection. Even after the formal end of empire, the traces of British influence remain quietly embedded in the contours of everyday life, not only in former colonies, but across the entire global landscape. The British Empire, though dismantled as a structure of power, left behind a legacy of habits, systems, and ideas that continue to ripple through time. It is a legacy not easily defined, not wholly oppressive, nor entirely benign, but rather one of paradox, woven into the cultural fabric of nations across 6 continents. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of empire is the English language. Once confined to the British Isles, English is now spoken by billions around the world as a first language, a second language, or a bridge between cultures. It is the language of science and diplomacy, of global business and aviation, of pop music, legal codes, and digital communication. In cities like Nairobi, New Delhi, Kingston, and Kuala Lumpur, English coexists with local tongues, shaping and being shaped by them. Accents shift, idioms evolve, and new forms emerge. Nigerian English, Indian English, Caribbean English, each one carrying its own history, its own rhythm, and its own identity. What was once the language of empire has, in many places, become a tool for empowerment, creativity, and connection. Legal and political systems, too, often bear the imprint of British influence. In many former colonies, parliamentary structures were modelled on Westminster. Courts still cite common law principles introduced during colonial rule. Legal terms, habeas corpus, jury trial, due process, echo from British courtrooms into far-flung jurisdictions. Constitutions may have been rewritten, flags changed, and anthems composed anew, but in many nations, the shape of governance remains subtly aligned with British templates. This continuity can offer stability, but it can also carry with it the limitations of systems designed for a different time, a different context, and a different people. In the realm of education, colonial legacies are equally complex. British-style schooling was introduced across the empire, often with a focus on English literature, European history, and imperial geography. Generations of students in Accra, Lahore, or Bridgetown grew up reciting Shakespeare, learning about the Tudors, and memorizing the rivers of England. For some, this provided access to global knowledge and intellectual exchange. For others, it represented a loss, the marginalization of local languages, histories, and ways of knowing. Today, many post-colonial nations have sought to decolonize education, reintroducing indigenous perspectives, celebrating local achievements, and reshaping curriculums to reflect their own realities. Architecture offers another quiet testament to imperial presence. Across the former empire, cities feature buildings that blend British design with local materials and sensibilities. Government houses with white columns, railway stations with clock towers, schools with steep gabled roofs, all stand as monuments to a time when British aesthetics were exported alongside administration. In New Delhi, Nairobi, Singapore, and Suva, these structures still function, not just as relics, but as living parts of the urban landscape, repurposed and reinterpreted by those who inherited them. The Commonwealth of Nations, once rooted in colonial hierarchy, now exists as a voluntary association of over 50 countries, most of them former British colonies, but all equal in status. Though its relevance is sometimes debated, the Commonwealth serves as a forum for cooperation on issues like climate change, education, and development. It organizes cultural and sporting events, such as the Commonwealth Games, and facilitates diplomatic dialogue among nations with diverse paths and perspectives. Some see it as a symbol of post-imperial goodwill. Others regard it as a lingering vestige of empire. Either way, it reflects the complex nature of imperial legacy, part connection, part contradiction. In popular culture too, the British Empire continues to appear, sometimes as romanticized adventure, sometimes as critique. Novels, films, and television series revisit colonial settings with varied lenses. Stories of explorers, soldiers, rebels, and revolutionaries unfold on screens and pages across the world. Some reinforce imperial nostalgia. Others seek to expose the pain and inequity of colonial rule. Still others try to hold both truths at once, acknowledging the beauty, the loss, the tension, and the change. Food and language intertwine in similar ways. British menus were forever changed by empire: tea from India and Sri Lanka, curry spices from South Asia, sugar from the Caribbean. Fish and chips, that most British of meals, owes part of its lineage to Sephardic Jewish immigrants and the global fish trade. Meanwhile, in the former colonies, local cuisines absorbed and reimagined British staples, creating new hybrids that tell stories of movement, adaptation and exchange. Jamaican patties, Anglo-Indian chutneys, Malaysian kaya toast, each one a quiet reminder of shared history. And yet, alongside these visible legacies, there are deeper echoes, those that cannot be measured in language or law, but in memory and experience. In how histories are remembered or forgotten, in how families trace their roots across oceans, in how identity is shaped by both belonging and displacement. For some, the empire is a distant abstraction. For others, it is an intimate inheritance, a story written across generations, in migration papers, ancestral homes, and inherited names. The legacy of the British Empire is not a closed book. It continues to evolve with every conversation about reparations, every statute debated, every syllabus rewritten. It is present in the global spread of protest movements, in the rise of diasporic voices, and in the reimagining of histories long overshadowed. It is found in the silences between what was recorded and what was lived. As we pause here, consider how empire lives on, not just in what it built, but in what it left behind. In connections forged and divisions created, in systems sustained and stories silenced. The British Empire may have faded from political maps, but its shadow still stretches across time. The retreat of the British Empire did not leave a blank slate behind. Instead, it left a complex web of boundaries, alliances, and institutional frameworks, many of which continue to define the geopolitics of the 21st century. Across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, the borders of newly independent nations were often drawn by colonial administrators, sometimes hastily, often with little regard for the histories, identities, or relationships of the people who lived there. What emerged was a world shaped by imperial convenience, not necessarily by local coherence. In the Middle East, for example, British influence after the First World War played a decisive role in the creation of new nations, Iraq, Jordan, and the British Mandate in Palestine among them. Lines were inked across deserts, dividing communities and assigning rulers. Promises made to different groups during the war, including Arabs and Zionists, were never fully reconciled. The resulting tensions, particularly in Palestine, would lead to enduring conflict. Even today, the geopolitical dilemmas of the region echo with the decisions made during Britain's imperial stewardship. In South Asia, the partition of British India into India and Pakistan was a monumental and traumatic event. The border, drawn hurriedly in 1947, split not only land but families, cultures, and faiths. Violence accompanied the transition, and the wounds of partition still shape relations between the two nuclear-armed neighbors. Kashmir, a princely state caught between competing claims, became a flashpoint that remains unresolved, a direct legacy of colonial exit and the ambiguities it left behind. Africa, too, bears the imprint of colonial cartography. When Britain and other European powers carved up the continent in the late 19th century, they created borders that often paid little heed to existing ethnic, linguistic, or political divisions. The legacy of these artificial boundaries continues to influence conflict dynamics, electoral tensions, and national identity across the continent. In countries like Nigeria, Kenya, and Sudan, colonial borders have complicated efforts at unity and governance long after independence was achieved. But the legacy of the British Empire is not only visible in borders, it also lives on in institutions. After the Second World War, as the global order was being rebuilt, Britain played a foundational role in shaping the emerging international system. It was a key player in the creation of the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank. Many of these institutions, while global in name, were structured in ways that reflected the interests and hierarchies of the imperial age. Voting rights, development policies, and diplomatic protocols often favored the powerful nations, including Britain and its closest allies, embedding inequality into the very framework of international cooperation. In the realm of law and diplomacy, the legacy runs even deeper. International maritime law, much of which governs trade and territory today, was heavily influenced by British naval practices. Diplomatic customs, ceremonial language, and even legal categories like sovereignty and nationhood were filtered through the lens of British imperial experience. For many newly independent countries, engaging with this system meant learning to navigate a world built on concepts not of their own making, yet concepts they had to adopt in order to be recognized and heard. The Commonwealth, too, plays a subtle role in the global stage. Though largely symbolic, it remains a diplomatic space where leaders from diverse backgrounds gather. Shared language, legal traditions, and educational ties have created a soft infrastructure of influence, one that can ease dialogue or encourage trade, even in the absence of formal alliances. For Britain, the Commonwealth offers a reminder of its global past. For its members, it can serve as a space of both continuity and critique. In defense and intelligence, the post-imperial world also retained deep connections. The Five Eyes Alliance, a signals intelligence partnership between the United Kingdom, the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, grew in part from shared imperial roots. Military bases in former colonies continued to host British or Allied forces. Strategic positions like Gibraltar, Diego Garcia, and the Falkland Islands remained under British control, forming a vestigial archipelago of geopolitical relevance in a world no longer ruled from London. And yet, the legacy of empire is not only visible in formal structures, it also shapes perceptions, the way nations see each other and themselves. Former colonies often carry the burden of being labeled developing, post-colonial, or emerging, while former imperial powers are assumed to be more stable or advanced. These categories, while sometimes useful, are deeply rooted in a worldview shaped by centuries of domination and hierarchy. They influence foreign aid, trade negotiations, and the expectations placed upon nations navigating the lingering shadow of imperialism. Even in moments of global crisis, economic downturns, pandemics, climate change, the legacies of empire are felt. Resource extraction during colonial times left many nations with economies overly dependent on raw materials or single exports. Infrastructure was built to serve empire, not resilience. Health systems, educational networks, and environmental policies were shaped by decades of foreign rule, and the aftershocks still reverberate. In international forums, calls for reparations or debt relief often trace their origins back to colonial histories that are not as distant as they seem. As we look at today's world, a world of migration and multiculturalism, of global trade and rising nationalism, we begin to see how the British Empire helped create both the opportunities and the challenges of our time. It connected peoples, yes, but often on unequal terms. It built systems, yes, but often at great cost. And while it no longer governs, it still informs the rules by which we live. Let your thoughts rest here for a moment. The story of empire has moved beyond conquest, beyond flags and rulers. Now it exists in subtler forms, in treaties and timelines, in languages spoken and disputes unresolved. The geopolitical world we know today did not arise from nothing. It was shaped in no small part by an empire that once claimed the seas and redefined the map. The scale of the British Empire often draws our attention to the vast, to continents, fleets, and sweeping laws. But beneath those structures were human beings, each one shaped in some way by the empire's reach. To understand that history fully, we must pause and listen, not to rulers and generals alone, but to those whose stories rarely made it into the official records. The merchant in Bombay, the sugar worker in Barbados, the schoolgirl in Nairobi, the soldier in Flanders, the house servant in London. Each life a thread in the intricate, often tangled fabric of empire. Consider for a moment the Indian sepoy recruited by the East India Company and later the British Crown. He stood at the crossroads of culture, loyalty and power. In uniform, he drilled under British officers. He marched through heat and snow, through revolts and wars, often far from home. Some served with pride, earning medals and pensions. Others wrestled with the knowledge that they were enforcing foreign rule over their own people. The 1857 uprising began, in part over rifle cartridges rumored to be greased with animal fat offensive to Hindu and Muslim beliefs. But beneath that flashpoint lay years of quiet discontent, of discipline imposed, of voices unheard. Or picture a Jamaican woman in the late 19th century, a laundress or midwife, working under the Caribbean sun. Her ancestors had been brought across the Atlantic in chains. She now lived in a society governed by British law, shaped by English language and Christian schools. Her days were long, her rights limited, her opportunities few, and yet through music, oral tradition, and community networks, she preserved a culture that could not be erased. Her life was not recorded in imperial archives, but her resilience formed the unspoken foundation of empire. In Malaya, rubber plantations drew thousands of Tamil laborers under colonial contracts. They worked under a punishing climate, often for meager pay, living in barrack-style quarters far from the lands of their birth. Children grew up knowing both British schooling and deep ancestral traditions. Identity was not a simple thing. It was layered and often conflicted, shaped by displacement, adaptation, and the unsteady balance between empire's demands and personal survival. In Britain itself, life under empire took its own form. The empire was present in shop windows and daily rituals, the tea on the table, the cotton in shirts, the spices in dinner stews. Middle-class families read tales of distant colonies in serialized novels, watched parades of colonial troops on Empire Day, and bought postcards from lands they would never visit. Yet, even in the heart of the metropole, not all were passive consumers. Sailors from West Africa and South Asia settled in port cities like Liverpool and Cardiff. Students from the Caribbean debated politics in London cafes. Black and brown Britons, though often treated as outsiders, were always part of the imperial story. And then there were the children, those who grew up in the twilight of empire, caught between shifting worlds. In Kenya or Trinidad, in Singapore or Guyana, they studied under Union Jack flags and read British textbooks. They learned about Shakespeare and empire builders, while their own histories were minimized or ignored. Some grew up to question what they had been taught. Others became leaders of new nations. Their journeys were shaped by inheritance and rupture, by the push and pull of pride and pain. Letters offer a special window into these lives. In faded ink on fragile paper, we find words from soldiers writing home to mothers, from wives describing a new climate, from students describing their hopes. These were not grand speeches or official proclamations, just fragments of human thought, shaped by the conditions of empire. A tea planter in Assam writing to a brother in London, a missionary nurse in Rhodesia reporting on her work, a clerk in Accra asking about wages overdue. Each one reveals not only what empire did, but how it felt. The story of labor, too, runs deep. From Indian indentured workers in Fiji to African miners in Rhodesia to Chinese builders on railways in the colonies, empire ran on the hands and backs of millions. Often their work was undervalued, their suffering unrecorded. But their presence was essential. They fed, built, cleaned, guarded, and moved the machinery of empire. Without them, the imperial project could not have sustained itself. Their lives, though often marginalized, deserve the same attention as any viceroy or admiral. We must also pause to consider those who resisted, not only through uprisings or politics, but in quieter acts. A student who questioned his colonial history book, a market woman who refused a new tax, a poet who wrote in her mother tongue, though taught in English. Resistance was not always dramatic. It was often subtle, an act of memory, a choice to speak differently, a refusal to forget. As the empire receded, its people moved. Migration flowed from colony to metropole. Families uprooted by war or partition sought new lives. Former civil servants and soldiers tried to find meaning in changed societies. Diasporas formed in Toronto, Birmingham, Auckland, and beyond, and with them came new cultures, new tensions, and new syntheses. Empire had never been a one-way street. Even in its decline, it remained a space of movement, of journeys that continue to this day. Let your thoughts drift now among these many lives, the nameless and the known, the remembered and the forgotten. The empire was vast, but its story is found in the quiet moments of ordinary people. Their experiences, layered, rich and real, offer the most intimate truths of what empire was and what it meant. Beneath the stories of conquest and culture, of commerce and conflict, lies another quieter legacy of the British Empire, one that shaped the very land itself. The environment, though often overlooked in historical accounts, was profoundly altered by centuries of imperial activity. Forests were cleared, rivers redirected, crops transformed, and species uprooted and transported across oceans. Empire did not only govern people, it reordered nature, often permanently, and often without fully understanding the consequences. From the earliest days of colonization, British interests were closely tied to the extraction of natural resources. Land was measured, catalogued, and surveyed, its value assessed not in terms of ecology, but in terms of economic output. In the Caribbean, sugar plantations consumed vast tracts of fertile land, replacing diverse ecosystems with monocultures designed for profit. Forests once rich with wildlife and medicinal plants were razed to make way for rows of cane, tended by enslaved labor under a relentless sun. The soil, overworked and depleted, bore the scars of this transformation long after the plantations closed. In India, the British colonial administration initiated massive irrigation and canal projects, altering the flow of rivers and reshaping agricultural rhythms. While these changes sometimes increased crop yields, they also disrupted traditional water management systems that had sustained communities for centuries. In regions like Punjab, the introduction of intensive farming techniques, encouraged by imperial planners, would later contribute to long-term ecological stress. Forest management was systematized, but often with the aim of timber extraction rather than conservation. Teak, sal, and sandalwood were logged in enormous quantities to feed industries far away. Railway construction, shipbuilding, and furniture manufacture among them. Australia and New Zealand offer another window into ecological disruption. British settlers, arriving with familiar expectations of what a landscape should be, brought with them plants, animals, and farming practices unsuited to local conditions. Rabbits, introduced for sport and food, quickly became a destructive force across the Australian continent, outcompeting native species and devastating grasslands. In New Zealand, dense forests were felled to create pasture land, forever altering the island's biodiversity. Indigenous knowledge systems, which had once guided sustainable interaction with these environments, were often dismissed or disregarded by colonial authorities. In Africa, the imperial focus on cash crops, cotton, coffee, cocoa, tea, reshaped entire landscapes. Land that had once supported local food systems was converted into export-driven agriculture. Colonial economies were often designed to supply raw materials to Britain, leaving colonized regions vulnerable to famine when food production was neglected. In places like Kenya and Malawi, vast estates were created to serve distant markets, not the needs of local communities. Over time, this imbalance would contribute to cycles of hunger, economic dependency, and land degradation. The global movement of plants and animals, sometimes called the Columbian Exchange, though its effects extended into the imperial age, was dramatically accelerated under British rule. Botanical gardens, such as Kew in London, became imperial hubs of scientific exploration and agricultural experimentation. Seeds, saplings, and specimens were collected from colonies around the world and tested for their economic potential. Tea plants from China were transplanted to Assam. Rubber trees from Brazil were smuggled to Ceylon and Malaya. Cinchona, the source of quinine, was cultivated to support colonial expansion into malaria-prone regions. These botanical endeavors were not merely scientific, they were deeply tied to empire's strategic and economic aims. This manipulation of nature also extended to human health and disease. In the tropics, colonial authorities grappled with unfamiliar illnesses, malaria, yellow fever, sleeping sickness, and responded by reshaping environments in the name of sanitation and control. Swamps were drained, forests cut back, and insect populations studied, not out of concern for local ecology, but to protect soldiers and settlers. Public health campaigns often centered on European needs, while indigenous understandings of illness and healing were sidelined. Colonial hunting, too, left its mark. In parts of Africa and India, the British elite engaged in big game hunts, often as a symbol of dominance over nature and by extension over colonized peoples. Elephants, tigers, rhinos and lions were pursued not only for sport but for trophies. Game reserves and national parks were established, but often at the cost of displacing indigenous communities who had lived sustainably on that land for generations. Conservation, as practiced under empire, was frequently entangled with control. Even the concept of wilderness changed under British rule. Landscapes were romanticized or deemed untamed, especially when they did not align with European ideas of cultivation or productivity. In doing so, imperial administrators often ignored or erased the complex relationships that indigenous peoples had with the land. Forests were not empty, nor deserts barren. These were spaces of meaning, of memory, of survival. Empire, in seeking to dominate them, often misunderstood them. The same duality extended to landscapes themselves. To some imperial eyes, the highlands of East Africa resembled Scottish moors, while tea plantations in India evoked a kind of pastoral England transplanted abroad. In many cases, the natural world was not only altered, it was reimagined, reshaped to reflect colonial ideals. Trees were planted along railway lines for shade, gardens were cultivated to reflect British tastes, and town plans imposed gridded order onto ancient geographies. Nature was expected to conform, to become legible, useful, and familiar. But nature has a memory. The patterns of erosion, the disappearance of native species, the spread of invasive ones, these are not just environmental shifts, but quiet testimonies to history. In places where empire once loomed large, the land itself bears witness. Rivers rerouted, forests fragmented, coastlines reshaped by ports that once connected colonies to capital. Even today, conservationists and farmers must work with or against the environmental legacy left behind. And so, the environmental story of the British Empire is not just one of damage, but of transformation, of ecosystems reordered, of knowledge exchanged and erased, of landscapes forever changed. It is a reminder that empire was not only written in laws and letters, but also in the earth and water, in root and branch, in wind and soil. Now, let your thoughts drift through those altered landscapes, from the misty tea gardens of Darjeeling to the grasslands of the Cape, from the sugarcane rows of Barbados to the dense forests of Borneo. The empire may be gone, but its footprints remain in the land, faint, enduring, and quietly alive. Across the vast expanse of the British Empire, where cultures collided and communities were drawn into new systems of rule, religion moved as both guide and instrument. It shaped how people understood the world and their place within it. It offered comfort and identity, even as it was at times used as a tool of authority. Faith in all its forms flowed through the arteries of empire, sometimes imposed, sometimes embraced, often transformed in ways neither missionaries nor administrators could fully control. Christianity played a central role in the imperial project. From the earliest voyages of colonization, British explorers and settlers brought with them not only goods and flags, but also Bibles, prayer books, and crosses. The missionary movement gained momentum in the 18th and 19th centuries, with societies like the Church Missionary Society and the London Missionary Society dispatching men and women to Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. Their stated aim was to bring salvation, to convert souls and spread Christian morals. But in practice, their work became deeply entangled with colonial administration, education, and cultural change. In many colonies, the missionary school became the first formal institution a child might encounter. Here, reading and writing were often taught alongside scripture. English was emphasized as the language of both heaven and empire. Children memorized verses, recited catechisms, and learned to view their world through the lens of British Protestant values. For some, this education offered opportunity, a path to employment, influence, or a new identity. For others, it represented a loss of language, of tradition, of sacred ways of life passed down for generations. Yet conversion was never a simple or uniform process. Indigenous belief systems did not vanish at the arrival of missionaries. Instead, they adapted, resisted, and sometimes quietly blended with Christian teachings. In West Africa, for example, Christianity was shaped by local cosmologies, leading to the rise of African-initiated churches with unique theologies and worship styles. In India, certain communities engaged with Christian texts and ethics without fully abandoning their own spiritual frameworks. Religion under empire was not a one-way transmission. It was a layered exchange, marked by negotiation and reinvention. The British Empire also governed vast populations who practiced religions other than Christianity, including Islam, Hinduism, Sikhism, Buddhism, and a wide range of indigenous spiritual traditions. In India, the diversity of belief systems posed both a challenge and a fascination to British officials. Early colonial administrators often studied Sanskrit texts and Mughal law codes, attempting to govern through an understanding of existing religious structures. Over time, however, their efforts at classification, distinguishing between Hindu and Muslim, codifying marriage and inheritance laws, defining caste hierarchies, helped harden divisions that had once been more fluid. What began as an attempt to manage complexity often led to oversimplification and, in some cases, enduring communal tensions. In Muslim-majority regions such as parts of India, Malaya, and northern Nigeria, the British often took a more cautious approach. Rather than direct interference in religious life, they ruled through local leaders, imams, qadis, and emirs, preserving Islamic legal systems where convenient and limiting missionary activity. This policy of indirect rule was meant to ensure stability, but it also reinforced religious authority structures in ways that could restrict reform or deepen inequality. In settler colonies, religion often served as a foundation for social norms and identity. In Australia, Canada, and parts of southern Africa, Christianity was closely tied to colonial values of order, work ethic, and family life. Churches were often central to community life, places not just of worship, but of social gathering and education. Yet this religious presence also played a role in the marginalization of indigenous peoples. In residential schools across Canada and Australia, Christian teachings were used to erase native languages and belief systems, often through force. These were spaces of both spiritual instruction and profound cultural loss, scars that remain to this day. But faith also served as a source of resistance. Across the empire, religion provided a language through which people challenged injustice and envisioned liberation. In India, figures like Mahatma Gandhi infused political movements with spiritual philosophy, drawing from Hindu, Jain, and Christian ideas alike. In the Caribbean, religious revivalism blended African and Christian traditions, offering hope and identity to communities long oppressed. In West Africa, prophetic movements emerged, challenging colonial power with visions of divine justice. In Southern Africa, churches became places of political organizing, nurturing future leaders of resistance and reform. Even within Britain, the empire's religious encounters left their mark. Immigrant communities from former colonies established mosques, gurdwaras, mandirs, and temples in towns and cities across the UK. The spiritual geography of Britain itself began to change, reflecting the diversity of its imperial past. Debates over identity, integration, and religious freedom in the post-imperial age are part of this ongoing legacy, one in which faith remains a deeply felt and often contested thread. Through it all, religion in the British Empire cannot be understood as a monolith. It was a force of colonization and conversion, but also of resilience and reinterpretation. It offered both refuge and repression. It bridged worlds but also reinforced divisions, and above all it lived in people, in their rituals, their prayers, their doubts, and their acts of grace. Let your thoughts settle now among sacred spaces across the empire, from quiet shrines in Burma to grand mosques in Lahore, from mission churches in Lesotho to forest groves in New Zealand. These were places of worship, yes, but also places where people made sense of a changing world, and where the empire's reach met the enduring strength of the spirit. While the British Empire is often remembered in terms of conquest, governance, and economics, its influence reached just as deeply into the intimate fabric of daily life, into homes, family structures, and the roles assigned to men, women, and children. Empire shaped not only public policy and political borders, but private relationships and domestic expectations. Across colonies and in Britain itself, gender norms were reshaped by the realities of imperial rule, often in subtle and enduring ways. In British society, the imperial ideal of domesticity was closely tied to the image of the empire itself. A proper British home, orderly, moral, disciplined, was seen as a miniature reflection of imperial authority. Middle-class women were celebrated as guardians of virtue, expected to raise patriotic sons and loyal daughters, to manage households infused with civility and Christian values. The maternal figure came to symbolize moral stewardship, not just within the family, but across the empire. In missionary literature and colonial propaganda, British women were often portrayed as bearers of enlightenment, tasked with uplifting the domestic standards of colonized societies. This ideal traveled abroad in many forms. In settler colonies like Canada, Australia, and South Africa, British women were seen as agents of civilization. Their presence was believed to bring stability, respectability, and social cohesion. Programs were even developed to encourage women to emigrate, to provide companionship for male settlers, and to improve colonial society through the formation of British-style families. Yet life in the colonies could be far from genteel. Women on the frontier labored alongside men, managed farms and households in challenging climates, and often endured isolation. The ideal of the refined imperial matron did not always match the realities on the ground. In non-settler colonies, British women often worked as missionaries, teachers, or the wives of colonial officials. Many lived in enclaves, separate from the local population, upholding strict social hierarchies in daily interactions. Their roles were shaped by race and class, as well as by gender. A British woman might employ local servants while maintaining the moral boundaries of empire, boundaries that reinforced ideas of superiority, propriety, and separation. Yet some crossed those boundaries, forging friendships, offering education, and in rare cases, advocating for local women's rights. These acts of solidarity, however, remained the exception in a system structured by inequality. For colonized women, the impact of empire was varied and deeply contextual. In many parts of the empire, colonial rule reshaped traditional gender roles, often through laws and economic changes. In West Africa, for example, women had long been active traders and community leaders. British policies that favored male chiefs and taxed women's businesses often undermined their status. In India, colonial officials sometimes justified their presence by citing the need to rescue women from practices like sati or child marriage. While some reforms did improve conditions, they were often imposed without consultation and used to portray British rule as morally necessary. Colonial education systems played a central role in shaping new expectations for girls and women. Schools for girls were established by missionaries and colonial governments, often emphasizing domestic skills, hygiene, and Christian values. Literacy and numeracy were taught, but always through the lens of producing obedient daughters and suitable wives. For some young women, education opened doors to employment and activism. For others, it marked a departure from their community's traditions and ways of life. Marriage and family structures were also affected by imperial law. British legal codes often overrode or redefined indigenous systems of marriage, inheritance, and custody. In regions with strong customary law, such as parts of Africa and the Pacific, colonial courts sought to formalize practices that had previously been flexible and negotiated. This codification sometimes privileged patriarchal interpretations and diminished the rights women had once held within their own cultures. Divorce, widowhood, and property rights were filtered through imported frameworks, creating confusion and reinforcing dependence on colonial institutions. Children, too, were drawn into the imperial orbit. In British colonies, schooling became a tool for shaping young minds into loyal subjects. History lessons praised imperial heroes, geography lessons centered on Britain, and classroom discipline reflected Victorian ideals. But outside the school walls, children lived in complex realities, working in fields or markets, helping at home, or participating in resistance. In India, Gandhi once called on children to boycott British goods. In Kenya, children carried messages between Mau Mau fighters. In the Caribbean, young people organized around labor movements. Childhood, under empire, was not shielded from politics. Meanwhile, gender and class intersected in every corner of the empire. Elite women in colonized societies sometimes found new avenues for expression, forming clubs, writing literature, or participating in reform movements. At the same time, poor women often bore the brunt of empire's economic demands. In tea estates, mining towns and urban slums, women labored under harsh conditions as factory workers, domestic servants, or agricultural hands. Their work was often invisible in official records, yet essential to the functioning of colonial economies. And then there were the blurred spaces of intimacy, of affection, of taboo. Relationships between British men and local women occurred throughout the empire, sometimes consensual, often exploitative, and almost always shaped by deep power imbalances. These relationships produced children, sometimes accepted, sometimes hidden, sometimes ostracized. Colonial administrations developed policies around race and respectability, seeking to manage the complex social realities they had helped to create. The legacies of these relationships and the identities they formed remain deeply felt in many post-colonial societies today. Gender under empire was never one story. It was 1,000 overlapping experiences of constraint and agency, of adaptation and resistance. The empire dictated roles, but people reshaped them in ways both visible and subtle. In letters, in lullabies, in labor and love, the private world reflected the shifting rhythms of a global force. So rest now in these quiet domestic spaces, in a village courtyard, a missionary schoolroom, a distant homestead, a kitchen humming with voices. These were the hearths around which the British Empire spun its story, and where its legacy still lingers, gentle and complex. Beneath the ships and statutes, beyond the flags and borders, there was another empire, quieter, but no less influential. It was the empire of knowledge. Through its reach, the British Empire became not only a political and economic force, but a producer and organizer of global understanding. Science and medicine were central to this project, shaping how people, plants, bodies, and diseases were studied, classified, and controlled. Under empire, the pursuit of knowledge was not neutral. It carried assumptions, served power, and left behind a legacy as layered as the lands it sought to explain. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the expansion of British rule coincided with a surge in scientific inquiry. Colonial officials, missionaries, and explorers returned with sketches, specimens, and journals, filling museums and universities with curiosities from across the globe. Naturalists aboard ships like HMS Beagle catalogued flora and fauna. Surveyors mapped mountains, rivers, and coastlines with meticulous precision. Botanists studied tropical plants for their commercial potential. The empire became a vast laboratory. Its lands and peoples studied, named, measured, and sometimes misunderstood. Kew Gardens in London became a nerve center for botanical imperialism. Seeds and saplings were collected from colonies and cultivated in controlled greenhouses. Knowledge flowed both ways. Specimens were dispatched back out to colonies for cultivation, fueling plantations of tea, quinine, rubber, and sugarcane. These exchanges were framed as progress, but they also facilitated systems of exploitation and monoculture. Forests were replaced with fields. Biodiversity was reduced in the name of profit. The scientific lens, though focused, could overlook the complexity of ecosystems shaped over generations. Medicine under empire carried similar contradictions. On the one hand, Colonial governments introduced hospitals, vaccination campaigns, and sanitation systems. Tropical medicine emerged as a discipline, studying diseases like malaria, yellow fever, and sleeping sickness. British doctors worked to combat illnesses that had long plagued local populations and endangered colonial personnel. New drugs were developed, hospitals built, and research institutions established in cities like Calcutta, Lagos, and Singapore. Public health became part of imperial governance, a means to preserve order and productivity. Yet these medical efforts were never purely humanitarian. Health campaigns often prioritized the needs of European settlers, soldiers, and administrators. Indigenous knowledge systems, rich with herbal remedies, spiritual practices, and environmental awareness, were frequently dismissed as superstition. In some regions, traditional healers were criminalized. In others, they were tolerated but sidelined. The authority of Western medicine became a tool of colonial control, used to justify interventions into communities and bodies alike. Experiments and data collection were not always ethical. In various colonies, medical trials were conducted on vulnerable populations with limited consent. Prisoners, laborers, and the poor were sometimes exposed to treatments or studies without full understanding or choice. These practices, while not unique to the British Empire, reflected an imbalance of power that defined many aspects of colonial life, where the promise of science was often entwined with disregard for autonomy and dignity. Education played a crucial role in spreading scientific thinking across the empire. Schools and colleges established in the colonies taught British models of biology, physics, and chemistry. Students learned to conduct experiments, to classify plants, to measure and analyze the world. For some, this opened paths to new careers in medicine, engineering, or administration. For others, it meant the gradual replacement of indigenous knowledge systems with imported curricula. In many regions, science became both a tool of aspiration and a symbol of cultural displacement. But the flow of knowledge was not entirely one-sided. Many colonized peoples actively engaged with science and medicine on their own terms. Indian physicians blended Ayurvedic practices with Western diagnostics. African herbalists adopted certain treatments while preserving ancestral traditions. Chinese and Malay medical knowledge endured through community networks. Over time, a complex synthesis emerged, not rejection but adaptation. The empire sought to impose uniformity, but human curiosity and resilience reshaped knowledge into something local, layered, and lasting. Scientific exploration also extended to people themselves. The empire fostered disciplines like anthropology, ethnography, and linguistics, all aimed at understanding the vast diversity under British rule. But these studies often began from assumptions of hierarchy. Human difference was catalogued and sometimes racialized. Cultures were classified into stages of civilization, with European norms held as the highest standard. Museums filled with not just artifacts, but human remains and sacred objects removed from their communities, taken in the name of research, displayed in glass cases far from their origins. And yet, the empire's engagement with science was also marked by wonder. The night skies over the Indian Ocean, the coral reefs of the Pacific, the medicinal plants of the Amazon, all inspired deep fascination. Not every encounter was exploitative. Some were rooted in genuine curiosity, in awe, in the quiet exchange of insight between strangers. In these moments, science became what it always has the potential to be, a bridge across worlds. So pause now and imagine a shelf of labeled specimens, a field journal in the hands of a young researcher, a clinic tucked beside a tropical port. These were places where knowledge was gathered, sometimes shared, often contested. In the empire's vast theater, science played many roles: healer, classifier, exploiter, and explorer, each one leaving an imprint that lingers still. Beyond the ships and treaties, the wars and legislations, the British Empire also existed in the realm of imagination. It lived in paintings and poems, novels and songs, travel sketches and illustrated maps. Art and literature did not simply reflect empire, they helped shape it, justify it, question it, and ultimately remember it. Through the creative mind, empire was made visible to those who would never set foot in its distant outposts. It was beautified and mythologized, but also, over time, interrogated and dismantled. To understand the emotional and psychological dimensions of the British Empire, we must follow its trail through the stories it told. In 19th century Britain, empire was a dominant theme in visual culture. Painters depicted sweeping views of exotic landscapes, grand colonial processions, and scenes of native peoples framed in awe or subordination. These works were often romanticized, presenting the empire as a benevolent force, bringing light to the shadows. Artists like Thomas Daniel sketched the ruins of India, capturing temples and palaces with the eye of both admiration and possession. Others painted battle scenes, heroic last stands, and encounters between explorers and unfamiliar cultures, transforming the complexities of colonial experience into tableau for public admiration. Illustrated journals and books brought the empire home to British audiences. Engravings and watercolors showed life in the colonies, filtered through European eyes. Jungle scenes, desert vistas, bustling bazaars, each image carried assumptions about wilderness, civilization, and difference. These visuals were often accompanied by travel writing, a genre that flourished under empire. Explorers, missionaries, and colonial officials wrote of their journeys with a mixture of observation and imagination, describing new lands with wonder, but also with the language of conquest and classification. The literary world, too, was suffused with empire. Novels and poems drew heavily from colonial settings, weaving stories that both entertained and reinforced imperial ideology. Rudyard Kipling, perhaps the most famous literary voice of empire, portrayed British India as a place of mystery, duty, and danger, a land to be ruled with firm but paternal care. His poem, The White Man's Burden, captured the prevailing belief that empire was not just a right, but a moral responsibility. The tropes of savagery and civilization, of native passivity and British valor, ran deep in such works, shaping how generations of readers viewed the world beyond Britain's shores. Children's literature was especially steeped in imperial themes. Boys' adventure stories, filled with tales of jungle treks, lost cities, and noble savages, cultivated a sense of British superiority and destiny. Series like The Boy's Own Paper and novels by authors like G.A. Henty inspired young readers to imagine themselves as future soldiers, explorers, and administrators. Even whimsical works, like Peter Pan or The Jungle Book, carried subtle messages about race, hierarchy, and control. In these pages, the empire was not questioned but assumed, a backdrop for personal growth, bravery, and British virtue. But the artistic world also held contradictions. Some artists and writers, particularly in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, began to question the empire's foundations. They saw its violence, its hypocrisies, its human costs. E.M. Forster's A Passage to India explored the fragility of connection between colonizer and colonized. Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, though controversial, peeled back the moral facade of imperialism, revealing a deeper rot within. These works did not reject the empire outright, but they complicated it, showing it not as a triumph, but as a tangled, unsettling enterprise. In the colonies themselves, literature and art offered both assimilation and resistance. Colonial education systems promoted British literary traditions, often at the expense of local languages and stories. But over time, writers from the colonized world began to reclaim the pen. In India, authors like Rabindranath Tagore and later Mulk Raj Anand wrote in English, but on their own terms. In the Caribbean, poets and novelists captured the rhythms of island life, the echoes of slavery, and the longing for freedom. In Africa, writers like Chinua Achebe and Ngugi wa Thiong'o challenged colonial narratives, illuminating the richness of indigenous traditions and the deep wounds of colonial disruption. Visual art followed a similar path. While some colonial artists adopted European techniques and themes, others blended them with traditional styles, creating hybrid forms that spoke to layered identities. Post-colonial art became a medium for remembrance, critique, and healing. Paintings, murals, and installations explored themes of migration, memory, displacement, and pride. Museums and galleries, once filled with colonial trophies, began to confront their own histories, recontextualizing collections, collaborating with descendant communities, and questioning what should be displayed and why. The empire also left a legacy of architecture that remains both admired and debated. Colonial buildings, government houses, courthouses, churches, and schools still stand across former colonies. Some are preserved as heritage sites. Others have been repurposed or abandoned. In their stone and symmetry lie both the aspirations of empire and the tensions of its aftermath. They are monuments not only to power, but to the passage of time, reminders that history can be both beautiful and burdensome. Even today, the arts continue to grapple with empire. Writers, filmmakers, and musicians from across the former British world revisit colonial themes with fresh eyes. They tell stories of diaspora, of cultural survival, of new belonging. They challenge old stereotypes and offer new visions of what connection can look like after empire. Through memoirs, graphic novels, spoken word, and film, the empire is not only remembered, it is remade, piece by piece, in the voices of those it once sought to define. So rest now in this gallery of imagination, among oil portraits and paperbacks, in lines of verse and corridors of quiet architecture. The British Empire may have drawn lines on maps, but it also drew stories in the minds of millions. And in those stories, we find not just the empire that was, but the many ways it is still being understood. Beneath the grandeur of palaces and the reach of global maps, the British Empire was at its heart an economic system, one designed to extract, accumulate, and redistribute wealth along lines shaped by distance, power, and class. Its ports were not only gateways of exchange, but nodes in a vast financial machine. Its laws and infrastructure were often tailored less for local prosperity than for imperial efficiency. And its economy, while cloaked in the language of free trade and development, was deeply structured by inequality between colonizer and colonized, between center and periphery, between those who reaped profits and those who labored for them. From its earliest days, the empire was driven by commerce. The chartered companies of the 17th century, like the East India Company and the Royal African Company, were not mere agents of exploration, but enterprises seeking return on investment. They secured monopolies, negotiated treaties, and built armed forts to control trade in spices, textiles, gold, and slaves. These ventures blurred the line between private capital and state power. Ships flew company flags, but were often backed by royal support. Battles were waged in the name of commerce. Profits funded both shareholders in London and military campaigns abroad. In India, the East India Company gradually evolved from a trading entity into a governing authority, collecting taxes, minting currency, and controlling land. Its economic policies transformed traditional agrarian structures, introducing new systems of revenue extraction like the permanent settlement and ryotwari. These systems prioritized predictability and profit over sustainability, often leaving farmers vulnerable to famine and debt. Cash crops like indigo, opium, and cotton were encouraged over food grains, creating cycles of scarcity and dependence. In the Caribbean, the plantation economy was the engine of British wealth during the 17th and 18th centuries. Sugar, produced by enslaved Africans under brutal conditions, became the lifeblood of imperial commerce. The triangular trade linked Britain, West Africa, and the Americas, shipping manufactured goods to Africa, enslaved people to the Caribbean, and sugar, rum, and tobacco back to Europe. The profits of slavery were not confined to the colonies. They funded banks, built stately homes, endowed universities, and underwrote the growth of British industry. The abolition of the slave trade in 1807 and of slavery itself in the British Empire in 1833 marked a moral turning point, but not an end to exploitation. Former slaveholders were compensated by the British government, while the newly emancipated received little or nothing. In their place, a new system of indentured labor emerged. Workers from India, China, and other parts of Asia were recruited, often under deceptive contracts, to toil in plantations in the Caribbean, Africa, and the Pacific. Their lives were governed by strict rules and limited freedoms. Though not enslaved, they worked under conditions of hardship and marginalization. As the Industrial Revolution reshaped Britain, its colonies became both sources of raw materials and markets for manufactured goods. Railways, ports, and telegraphs were constructed not merely to modernize, but to extract more efficiently. In Africa, copper, gold, and rubber were mined to feed global industries. In Malaya, tin and rubber became key exports. In Australia and Canada, wheat, wool, and minerals flowed toward imperial markets. These goods enriched Britain's factories, shipyards, and stock exchanges. Yet, local economies were often stunted, unable to develop independently or diversify. Taxes played a key role in imperial finance. In many colonies, subjects paid taxes on land, salt, animals, and trade. These revenues were used to fund colonial administrations and infrastructure, but also to maintain military forces and send profits back to Britain. For ordinary people, taxation often meant hardship. In India, the salt tax became a symbol of resistance, famously challenged by Gandhi's Salt March in 1930. In Africa, hut and poll taxes forced people into wage labor, disrupting traditional livelihoods and fueling unrest. Labor movements emerged within this imperial framework. Workers in the colonies, miners, dockers, plantation laborers, and clerks organized strikes and protests. In the Caribbean, trade unions became platforms for political mobilization. In South Africa, labor movements often intersected with anti-racist and anti-colonial activism. In India, textile workers in Bombay and railway workers across the country demanded fair wages and better conditions. Though often suppressed, these movements planted the seeds of independence and shaped future political struggles. Wealth flowed unevenly. For every colonial governor or London investor who prospered, there were countless laborers whose hands and backs built that prosperity. Economic development was not absent from the colonies. Roads, hospitals, banks, and schools were built, but it was rarely designed for equitable growth. Infrastructure served the needs of extraction and control. Industries were kept dependent on British markets and intermediaries. Indigenous entrepreneurship was often sidelined or restricted. And yet, within this system, people found ways to survive, adapt, and resist. Local markets thrived in the spaces between export zones. Craftsmen and traders navigated both traditional and colonial economies. Families pooled resources, migrated for work, and invested in their children's education. These acts of economic agency, though often invisible in official records, were the quiet foundations of endurance. Today, the legacy of empire's economic design is still visible. Former colonies continue to grapple with debt, dependency on exports, and unequal trade relationships. Global supply chains echo old patterns of movement and control. Discussions around reparations, development aid, and economic justice are rooted in the long history of how wealth was made, moved, and withheld under empire. So let your thoughts drift now through the markets and mills, the counting houses and cane fields, the rhythms of labor and the silence of ledgers. The empire's story is not only written in politics, but in the exchange of coins and the calloused hands of those who earned them. And in this long arc of commerce and toil, we begin to see how deeply the empire shaped the economic world we now inhabit. The British Empire, though often imagined as a merchant's domain or a civilizing mission, was always underpinned by force. Behind the treaties and tariffs stood soldiers, men drawn from across the globe, clad in red coats or khaki, carrying muskets and rifles, marching beneath flags they did not always choose. The British Army and Royal Navy, along with countless local regiments and auxiliary forces, served as the scaffolding of empire. They enforced order, projected power, and responded to resistance. But within their ranks were stories of loyalty and loss, discipline and defiance, quiet echoes of empire's human machinery. In the early phases of expansion, imperial warfare was often ad hoc. Trading companies like the East India Company raised their own private armies, composed of European officers and large numbers of locally recruited troops, especially in South Asia. These sepoys formed the backbone of military campaigns in India and beyond, their loyalty rewarded but never fully trusted. The 1857 Indian Rebellion, ignited in part by grievances within the ranks, shattered this illusion. In its aftermath, the British Crown assumed direct control of India, and the army was restructured to prevent such uprisings, with recruitment strategies emphasizing loyalty from select ethnic and regional groups, a tactic known as the martial races theory. Elsewhere too, Britain leaned heavily on colonial forces. In Africa, regiments such as the King's African Rifles were raised to maintain internal control and serve in imperial campaigns. In the Caribbean, African-descended soldiers had long served in the West India regiments, posted far from home to ensure detachment from local sympathies. In the Middle East, North Africa, and Southeast Asia, local auxiliaries, scouts, and garrison troops worked alongside British officers. Their uniforms and drills followed British models, but their experiences were shaped by complex intersections of class, culture, and command. The Royal Navy, the silent enforcer of trade routes and territorial claims, was central to Britain's global power. From the 18th century onward, it dominated sea lanes, blockaded rivals, and ferried soldiers and supplies between colonies. Naval bases in places like Gibraltar, Malta, and Singapore acted as strategic outposts. Control of the seas allowed Britain not only to defend its holdings, but to move quickly in response to rebellion or war. Sailors hailed from across the empire, though command remained tightly controlled by British elites. Life aboard ship was harsh, hierarchical, and often dangerous, but it also offered travel, steady pay, and a place in the imperial order. During the World Wars, colonial soldiers became essential to Britain's war effort. In the First World War, over 1 million men from India served on the Western Front, in Mesopotamia, and in East Africa. Troops from Africa, the Caribbean, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand fought in major campaigns. Many served with distinction, despite facing discrimination, poor conditions, and unequal recognition. In the Second World War, the contribution was even broader. African regiments fought in Burma, Indian soldiers battled in North Africa and Italy, and Caribbean airmen served in the RAF. The war expanded the role of empire, but also exposed its inequalities. After victory, many veterans returned to colonies still under British rule, their service honored in words, but not always in rights or resources. Military service was both a burden and a path. For some, it offered education, mobility, and a steady wage. For others, it meant separation from family, forced relocation, and service to a distant crown. Recruits were often driven by necessity, poverty, famine, or lack of other opportunities. Some volunteered out of pride or adventure, others were conscripted or pressured by local authorities. In every case, the decision to serve was shaped by circumstance, not merely by loyalty. Within the ranks, race and class defined experience. European officers often held commanding roles, while colonial soldiers filled the lower ones. Promotion was limited, rations and equipment unequal, and punishments more severe for non-European troops. Despite this, many units developed strong bonds, forged through hardship and camaraderie. Music, letters from home, and small rituals of daily life offered comfort amid the chaos of campaign. Military architecture dotted the empire, from hilltop forts in India to desert outposts in Sudan, from jungle barracks in Malaya to coastal batteries in the Caribbean. These were spaces of routine and regimentation, but also of memory. Soldiers carved their initials into stone, buried comrades in distant soil, and carried with them stories of battles fought and places seen. Cemeteries and monuments across the former empire still mark these histories, though often without full acknowledgement of those who fought under a flag not their own. Resistance to military service also emerged. During both world wars, some colonial subjects refused enlistment, protested conscription, or deserted. Anti-colonial movements criticized the use of native soldiers to suppress their own people or fight imperial wars. In Kenya, the Mau Mau uprising included former veterans disillusioned by broken promises. In India, the Quit India movement challenged British authority even as Indian troops served abroad. The contradictions were deep. Loyalty met with subjugation, sacrifice followed by silence. Today, the legacy of military service in the British Empire is being slowly re-examined. Memorials are being updated to reflect the diversity of those who served. Families trace ancestors who wore imperial uniforms. Veteran stories, long marginalized, are shared in oral histories and archives. Museums and documentaries explore not just battles, but the human lives within them, lives shaped by duty, distance, and often by displacement. So now, let your thoughts fall in step with these quiet battalions, marching down dusty roads in Burma, drilling beneath African skies, sailing on grey Atlantic waters. The British Empire was held together not only by ink and trade, but by the steady footsteps of those who bore arms in its name. And in their footsteps, we hear not only the echo of command, but the complexity of what it meant to serve. Across the British Empire, the law stood as one of its most enduring and visible structures. It shaped land ownership, labor, marriage, movement, and speech. It was often invoked as a hallmark of civilization, a system of fairness, predictability, and moral clarity. But beneath its promise of order lay a more complicated truth. Law in the empire was not always just. It was a tool of administration, a weapon of control, and at times a mask for domination. To walk through a colonial courtroom was to walk through the heart of imperial authority, where justice could mean very different things depending on who stood before the bench. In the early days of empire, legal systems were patchwork. In colonies like India, the Caribbean, and parts of Africa, British administrators encountered diverse systems of customary law, Islamic jurisprudence, Hindu legal codes, and oral traditions. Rather than abolish them outright, colonial authorities often co-opted or codified local laws, creating dual systems, one for Europeans and another for subjects. British common law governed settlers and the colonial elite, while indigenous populations were often subject to a combination of local customs and state interpretation. These hybrid systems were meant to preserve social order, but they also entrenched inequality. The principle of indirect rule, used most famously in Africa and parts of South Asia, relied on local chiefs, emirs, or village elders to administer justice under colonial oversight. Traditional leaders were empowered to enforce laws within their communities, but always under the eye of a British district officer or magistrate. This allowed the empire to govern vast territories with limited resources, but it also reshaped local authority. In some cases, colonial recognition elevated certain leaders while sidelining others, distorting pre-colonial balances and reinforcing hierarchy. Legal reform often arrived through British courts established in colonial capitals. These institutions introduced new procedures, trials by jury, legal representation, written testimony, and appeals. At their best, they offered consistency and recourse, particularly for those who could navigate the system. But for many, the courts remained distant and intimidating, their language unfamiliar, their procedures opaque. Access to justice was limited by race, class, and language, and outcomes often favored the powerful. Colonial law extended far beyond the courtroom. It regulated press freedom, political expression, labor contracts, and residency. In India, laws like the Vernacular Press Act and the Rowlatt Acts restricted dissent. In Kenya and Malaya, emergency regulations gave sweeping powers to arrest and detain without trial. Anti-sedition laws were common across the empire, used to silence activists, writers, and organizers. Even assemblies could be declared illegal, gatherings of more than a few people required permits, and public speech was closely monitored. Policing played a central role in enforcing colonial order. Police forces, often locally recruited but led by British officers, were tasked with maintaining stability and protecting imperial interests. In urban centers, they patrolled streets, monitored markets, and managed licensing and surveillance. In rural areas, they enforced tax collection, responded to resistance, and ensured compliance with land and labor laws. Uniformed and visible, they symbolized the daily reach of empire. Yet their presence was not always welcomed. Stories of abuse, bribery, and heavy-handed tactics surfaced regularly, especially where unrest simmered. Punishment under colonial law could be harsh. Prisons were often overcrowded and underfunded. Corporal punishment, including flogging, remained legal in many colonies into the 20th century. Penal colonies, such as those in the Andaman Islands or Australia, became sites of exile and labor. Forced labor laws, though framed as rehabilitation or public service, often blurred the line between sentence and exploitation. For political prisoners, Detention was not just about confinement, but about silencing. Despite this, legal systems under empire also produced moments of resistance and reform. Lawyers from colonized communities emerged, challenging injustice from within. Figures like Mohandas Gandhi, educated in British law, turned legal expertise into tools of protest. Courtrooms became stages for political argument, where colonial rule was questioned using the empire's own language. Over time, these efforts helped lay the foundation for nationalist movements and demands for constitutional reform. Law, too, shaped identity. Systems of registration, passbooks, and certificates regulated who could move, work, or vote. In some colonies, racial classification was encoded into legal status, determining rights, residency, and recognition. The law did not merely reflect empire. It constructed it, defining subjects, citizens, and strangers alike. After independence, many former colonies retained elements of British legal systems, common law principles, parliamentary structures, and judicial procedures remained embedded. Courts continued to cite British precedents, and judges wore wigs and robes long after colonial flags were lowered. These continuities offered stability, but also raised questions. What parts of the legal inheritance served justice? What needed to be rethought, reclaimed, or removed? Today, debates over colonial-era laws continue. In some countries, sedition acts, anti-homosexuality statutes, and press restrictions trace their origins to imperial rule. Movements to reform these laws are part of broader efforts to decolonize institutions and assert national sovereignty. Legal legacies, like so many aspects of empire, are not simply past. They are present, living in policy and precedent, in legal education and civil rights. So pause here, in the quiet chambers of empire's courts, among dusty ledgers and stern portraits, beneath the echo of gavel strikes and whispered appeals. The law, like empire itself, promised order but delivered complexity. And in its archives, we find not only records of judgment, but of struggle, transformation, and the long, uneven search for justice. In every corner of the British Empire, schools stood as quiet instruments of change. Some were grand institutions with columns and courtyards, others were single rooms with slate floors and benches, but all served as vessels of instruction, not just in reading and arithmetic, but in values, loyalties, and worldviews. Education under empire was never neutral. It was a means to shape minds, create order, and build the next generation of clerks, soldiers, teachers, and subjects. It offered opportunity, but also discipline. It preserved power, even as it sowed the seeds of its undoing. The colonial education system often mirrored Britain's own, with a hierarchy of schools, a standard curriculum, and examinations as gatekeepers of advancement. At the top stood elite institutions modeled after British public schools, educating the sons of local elites and loyal families. These schools produced a small class of anglicized administrators and professionals, fluent in English and familiar with British manners, literature, and law. Many graduates went on to serve in colonial bureaucracies, becoming the intermediaries between empire and local populations. Below this elite tier were missionary schools, village classrooms, and vocational institutes. These were more numerous, often underfunded, and frequently staffed by missionaries or local teachers trained in basic pedagogy. Here, students were taught obedience, cleanliness, and scripture alongside spelling and sums. Religious instruction was often central, especially in missionary-run schools, where conversion and character formation went hand in hand. In Muslim-majority areas, madrasas and Islamic schools continued to operate, sometimes with limited support from colonial governments, and sometimes in tension with them. Language lay at the heart of the colonial classroom. English was more than a medium of instruction, it was a symbol of access and authority. To speak it fluently was to open doors to employment, government, and social mobility. But this access came at a cost. In many colonies, the elevation of English led to the marginalization of indigenous languages. Textbooks ignored local history and literature. Oral traditions were deemed backward. Generations of children grew up fluent in a language not their own, reciting poems and histories from a distant isle while knowing little of their own ancestry. The classroom became a site not only of learning, but of cultural displacement. The content of colonial education was carefully curated. British history was taught with reverence, with an emphasis on monarchs, reformers, and military victories. The empire was portrayed as a civilizing mission, its expansion inevitable, its virtues self-evident. Geography lessons highlighted the vastness of the British world, often coloring the colonies in red on the map, reinforcing a sense of pride and possession. Moral instruction emphasized duty, loyalty, and order. Rarely were the darker aspects of colonialism, the violence, the exploitation, the resistance, part of the official curriculum. Yet for many, education also offered possibility. Literacy opened paths that had been closed for generations. Young people became teachers, clerks, nurses, and activists. Some used their schooling to navigate the structures of empire, others used it to challenge them. Across the colonies, educated elites began to question their place in the system. Why, they asked, were they taught liberty but denied representation? Why were they trained to serve but never to lead? In these questions lay the roots of political awakening. In India, the emergence of English-educated reformers and nationalists transformed the political landscape. Figures like Dadabhai Naoroji, B.R. Ambedkar, and Jawaharlal Nehru were products of colonial education, yet used their knowledge to critique British rule and advocate for self-determination. In Africa, leaders such as Jomo Kenyatta, Kwame Nkrumah, and Julius Nyerere blended their formal education with indigenous values, calling for decolonization and unity. In the Caribbean and Southeast Asia, poets, playwrights, and scholars began to write in ways that reclaimed voice and memory. Education became a battleground of ideas. Students protested unfair policies, demanded reforms, and formed debating clubs and study circles that grew into nationalist movements. Teachers served not just as instructors, but as mentors and mobilizers. In some cases, colonial authorities responded by tightening control, censoring textbooks, restricting scholarships, and monitoring school activity. But the momentum was hard to contain. The very tools empire used to educate also equipped people to question it. Gender played a key role in the classroom as well. Girls' education was often limited, especially in the early stages of empire. Where it did exist, it focused on domesticity, preparing women to be wives, mothers, and moral guides. Yet as literacy spread, women began to find their voices. Female teachers, writers, and reformers emerged, challenging both colonial and patriarchal systems. They advocated for girls' schooling, equal rights, and cultural revival. Their classrooms became spaces of quiet transformation. After independence, many former colonies retained elements of the British educational model. School uniforms, standardized exams, and curricula based on British frameworks continued. Some nations sought to indigenize their systems, incorporating local languages, histories, and traditions. Others balanced British legacies with new aspirations, building systems that honored both heritage and global connection. Today, the legacy of colonial education is still felt in language policies, curriculum debates, and access to opportunity. It shaped who could read, who could speak, who could lead. It taught millions to see the world through an imperial lens, even as it taught others to resist that view. And in classrooms across the former empire, the struggle to define identity, knowledge, and truth continues. So pause now in these rooms of learning, beneath chalk-dusted blackboards, beside battered desks, among whispered questions and carefully practiced lines. The empire's reach was not only in armies and borders, but in the quiet power of the classroom, where the future was written, one lesson at a time. The story of the British Empire is not only one of territory and governance, but of movement, of people carried across oceans and borders, sometimes by choice, often by necessity. From the forced migrations of enslaved Africans to the voyages of indentured laborers, from settlers seeking land to refugees escaping war, the empire was in constant motion. Its ports and pathways connected distant lands, creating a web of journeys that would shape the modern world. To trace these migrations is to trace the living, breathing heart of empire, its hopes, its traumas, its reach. One of the earliest and most devastating forms of imperial migration was the transatlantic slave trade. Though Britain was not the first to engage in the trade, it became one of its most dominant powers. Over 3 centuries, British ships transported millions of Africans across the Atlantic, forcibly uprooting them from their homelands and selling them into lives of brutal labor in the Americas. These journeys, marked by suffering and resistance, laid the economic foundation for British wealth, particularly in the sugar-producing colonies of the Caribbean. The legacies of this forced migration are still deeply felt in the descendants who live across the African diaspora, carrying memory and resilience in every generation. After the abolition of slavery, the empire turned to new systems of labor. Indentured servitude emerged as a way to supply plantations and colonial enterprises with workers. From the mid-19th century onward, over 2 million Indians were recruited to work in places like Mauritius, Fiji, Trinidad, Guyana, and East Africa. Promised wages and the possibility of return, many instead found hardship, isolation, and exploitation. Chinese indentured laborers also migrated under harsh contracts to Southeast Asia and the Caribbean. Though not enslaved, these laborers operated within a framework shaped by control and restriction. Some remained after their contracts ended, establishing new communities far from their ancestral homes. Alongside these labor migrations came voluntary settlers from Britain itself. Soldiers, administrators, farmers, and missionaries traveled to colonies in search of land, opportunity, or service. In settler colonies like Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, migration was encouraged as a means of establishing British presence and dominance. Land was surveyed and sold, often without consent from indigenous inhabitants. New towns, railways, and farms grew from these movements, bringing cultural familiarity for the settlers, but displacement and dispossession for many native communities. Empire also facilitated internal migrations within colonies. In Africa, people were moved to work in mines, on railroads, or in government posts far from home. In India, vast numbers relocated between rural villages and urban centers as colonial economies restructured traditional livelihoods. These shifts changed family life, language, and culture, creating hybrid identities and new patterns of belonging. Cities like Nairobi, Calcutta, and Kuala Lumpur became melting pots of movement, where colonial infrastructures brought strangers together, often under unequal terms. War, too, moved people. During the World Wars, colonial subjects were recruited or conscripted into military service. Indian soldiers marched in France, African troops fought in Burma, and Caribbean pilots flew over Europe. After the wars, some veterans chose to settle abroad, while others returned to find homes and governments unrecognizable. Conflict disrupted existing lives and planted the seeds for future migrations, as soldiers, refugees, and displaced civilians sought stability in new lands. In the decades following the Second World War, a new wave of migration reshaped the empire's heart. Britain, rebuilding from conflict and facing labor shortages, encouraged immigration from its former colonies. Caribbean migrants arrived aboard the Empire Windrush in 1948, followed by thousands more seeking work and opportunity. South Asian families settled in cities like Leicester, Birmingham, and London. African and Southeast Asian communities grew in urban neighborhoods across the UK. These migrants, once colonial subjects, now became citizens of the metropole, bringing with them languages, foods, religions, and memories of the empire they had once lived under from afar. Their arrival was not always met with welcome. Racism, housing discrimination, and employment inequality shaped the experience of many early migrants. Yet, despite challenges, these communities rooted themselves, built institutions, and reshaped the cultural fabric of Britain itself. Mosques, gurdwaras, Afro-Caribbean churches, curry houses, reggae studios, and corner shops became part of the everyday landscape. Migration had come full circle, from the colonies to the center, from subjecthood to citizenship. Elsewhere in the former empire, migration continued to define life. Families separated by oceans maintained ties through letters, remittances, and visits. Diasporic networks linked London to Lagos, Delhi to Durban, Kingston to Toronto. Migration was no longer a one-way journey, but a web of relationships that transcended borders and time zones. The empire, though dismantled politically, endured in the paths traced by its people. Today, the legacy of imperial migration is written into passports, surnames, and street signs. It's heard in the accents of bilingual children, in the rhythm of fusion cuisines, in the festivals celebrated far from their origins. Migration gave rise to new identities, not British or Indian, Jamaican or Canadian, but layered and evolving. For some, migration brought hope and freedom. For others, it carried trauma and loss. But for all, it was a defining thread in the tapestry of the post-imperial world. So rest now in the quiet movement of lives, the long sea voyages, the crowded train compartments, the shared rooms and waiting platforms. The British Empire was not only a force that conquered land, it was one that moved people across borders and generations, leaving behind stories that still unfold with every step. Scattered across the map of the former British Empire are cities that once pulsed with imperial purpose, built as trading ports, military outposts, administrative capitals, and centers of commerce. Some rose on ancient foundations, others were constructed from scratch, drawn in straight lines on planning boards in distant offices. These cities became the visible face of empire, their buildings imposing, their streets ordered, their rhythms shaped by colonial needs. And yet, within them, life flowed unpredictably, a mix of tradition and transformation, resistance and routine. To walk their streets is to walk through the layered memory of empire itself. Cities like Calcutta, Nairobi, Kingston, Singapore, and Lagos emerged as key urban nodes in the British imperial network. Each served as a hub, connecting rural hinterlands to global trade, hosting courts, banks, barracks, and schools. Governors and generals lived in grand colonial bungalows, often perched on hills above the rest. Civil servants moved through offices filled with ledgers and maps. Trams and railways carried goods and people to docks lined with crates stamped for London, Liverpool, or Manchester. These cities were designed not just to function, but to display the empire's supposed order and reach. Urban planning in the colonial world reflected imperial ideals. Central business districts and European quarters were laid out with symmetry and control. Broad boulevards, clock towers, and public gardens modeled on Victorian sensibilities. In contrast, indigenous neighborhoods were often left unregulated or deliberately segregated. In cities like Johannesburg, Rangoon, or Kampala, zoning laws reinforced racial divisions. Infrastructure followed suit. Piped water, sanitation, and electricity were more readily available in European areas than in native districts. The city, though shared in geography, was often split in experience. Despite these divides, colonial cities were places of contact and convergence. Markets buzzed with trade, spices, textiles, tools, and gossip flowing across language lines. Street corners hosted storytellers, preachers, and political meetings. Urban workers, porters, rickshaw pullers, clerks, and domestic servants navigated between different cultural worlds each day. In docks and railway yards, men and women from many regions mingled, forming communities that reflected both imperial connection and local adaptation. Architecture in these cities told its own story. Gothic spires rose beside mosque minarets and Hindu shrines. Government buildings bore crests and columns borrowed from Westminster, even as they overlooked palm-lined streets and open-air bazaars. Schools, hospitals, and post offices stood as markers of empire's infrastructure, their stone facades enduring long after colonial flags were lowered. In many places, colonial buildings were repurposed after independence, serving as parliament houses, museums, or libraries. Their function changed, but their presence still a reminder of past hierarchies. Cultural life in colonial cities was equally complex. British clubs and theatres operated behind high gates, hosting tea dances, bridge nights, and concerts. Access was often restricted by race or class. Meanwhile, indigenous theatres, music halls, and religious festivals brought colour and rhythm to the city's edges and alleyways. In cities like Bombay or Port of Spain, cultural fusion gave rise to new forms, blending British styles with local traditions to create hybrid music, cuisine, and fashion. These cultural exchanges were not always equal, but they were dynamic, giving voice to creativity amid control. Education and the press flourished in urban centers. Newspapers in English and local languages circulated political ideas, literary work, and news from abroad. Universities and colleges became breeding grounds for nationalist thought, offering students both colonial curricula and the tools to critique it. Political meetings, strikes, and protests often began in cities where people gathered in numbers large enough to demand attention. The colonial city was both a stage and a catalyst, a place where modern identities were formed and the future was imagined. Cities were also sites of inequality and unrest. Slums grew in the shadows of government buildings, housing workers who kept the city running but lived without its comforts. Epidemics and food shortages hit the poor hardest, exposing the fault lines of empire's promises. Urban policing, surveillance, and curfews were often used to suppress dissent. Yet from these same spaces arose some of the most powerful movements for change. Labor unions, religious groups, student associations, and women's organizations found footing in the city's ferment, using its density to amplify their voices. After independence, many former colonial cities faced the challenge of redefinition. Should they erase the past or incorporate it? Streets were renamed, statues were removed or reinterpreted, new skylines rose alongside colonial relics. And yet the legacy of empire remained, not just in architecture, but in patterns of land use, governance, and social inequality. Urban life, shaped for generations by colonial priorities, could not be easily unwound. Today, these cities are vibrant, sprawling, and diverse, their colonial cores surrounded by suburbs and informal settlements, shopping malls and tech hubs, art districts and universities. The rhythms of empire have faded, but the infrastructure remains. A courthouse still stands on its old foundation. A cricket match is played where colonial officers once gathered. A newspaper is printed in a language once imposed, now proudly claimed. So rest for a moment on a quiet city bench, hear the call to prayer, the chatter of school children, the shuffle of morning vendors setting up stalls. The cities of empire are still alive, not frozen in history, but in motion. They carry within their walls the sounds of power and protest, of routine and renewal, reminders that empire was not only fought in battlefields, but lived in streets. At the symbolic center of the British Empire stood the monarchy, a crown that bound together territories scattered across the globe. Kings and queens, though rarely seen in distant colonies, were ever present in image and ceremony. Their portraits hung in schoolrooms and court halls. Their names adorned streets, ships, and cities. Their jubilees were marked with parades, proclamations, and public holidays. In the empire's vast machinery of administration and commerce, the monarch played no direct role in daily governance. Yet in the hearts of its subjects, and in the stories the empire told about itself, the monarchy served as a steady unifying emblem of authority, continuity, and imagined kinship. In the early centuries of expansion, royal charters granted companies like the East India Company permission to trade and conquer in the name of the crown. Monarchs lent legitimacy to ventures far from English shores, often with little direct oversight. But as the empire matured, the symbolic role of the monarchy became more pronounced. The image of the sovereign came to stand for the empire itself, as protector, as parent, as source of justice. In print and in ritual, the crown was invoked to reassure subjects of imperial order and benevolence. The coronation of Queen Victoria in 1838 coincided with a period of significant imperial growth. Her reign saw Britain's reach extend across Asia, Africa, and the Pacific. In 1876, she was declared Empress of India, a title invented to solidify Britain's dominion over the subcontinent and to elevate Victoria's status in relation to other monarchs, particularly the powerful Tsar of Russia. The title was ceremonial, but it carried weight. In Delhi and London alike, it was used to reinforce the idea of one vast imperial family held together by loyalty to the crown. Public displays of allegiance to the monarchy were common throughout the empire. Jubilee celebrations in 1887 and 1897 were marked with processions, fireworks, and church services in colonies from Canada to Ceylon. Schools taught royal history as part of moral education. Colonial newspapers printed royal speeches and family news. When members of the royal family toured the empire, as they occasionally did, crowds gathered to catch a glimpse, waving flags and singing anthems. These events reinforced a sense of belonging, even if that belonging was often aspirational or one-sided. The monarchy also played a quiet role in reinforcing the racial and social hierarchies of empire. In settler colonies like Australia, Canada, and New Zealand, royal visits helped strengthen ties between the white populations and the metropole, cultivating a shared identity grounded in Britishness. In contrast, in colonies with majority non-European populations, The monarchy's presence was often filtered through intermediaries, governors, colonial secretaries, and local elites. While loyalty to the crown was promoted, access to its favor remained unequal. Still, for many colonized subjects, the crown held deep symbolic meaning. In India, some princes and maharajas proudly aligned themselves with the British monarch, seeing in the connection a source of prestige and protection. In Africa, chiefs who pledged allegiance were often granted medals, uniforms, and honorary titles. In the Caribbean and Southeast Asia, some communities saw the monarchy as distinct from the colonial government, a distant, almost mythical figure who might offer justice where local administrators failed. This distinction allowed loyalty to persist even as resistance to empire grew. During the two world wars, the monarchy served as a rallying symbol for imperial unity. Soldiers fought for king and country, and royal messages were broadcast across the empire, offering encouragement and thanks. Royal imagery was printed on medals, currency, and military badges. For many who served, the crown offered a sense of connection to a broader cause, even if their loyalty was not always rewarded with equality. After the Second World War, as independence movements gained momentum, the monarchy's role began to shift. Many newly independent nations chose to remain within the Commonwealth, retaining the British monarch as ceremonial head of state. Others declared republics, parting ways with the crown altogether. Queen Elizabeth II, who ascended the throne in 1952, became the face of a transitioning empire, visiting former colonies, meeting with new leaders, and redefining royal symbolism in an age of decolonization. Even as the empire declined, royal imagery persisted. Statues of monarchs remained in public squares. Coins continued to bear royal profiles. Some nations debated the relevance of the monarchy, while others embraced it as part of a shared, if complex, heritage. The crown had become not just a political symbol, but a cultural one, embedded in ceremonies, holidays, and national narratives. Today, the legacy of monarchy in the former empire is multifaceted. In countries like Canada and Australia, the monarch remains head of state, though republican movements continue to emerge. In others, the memory of the crown evokes pride, nostalgia, ambivalence, or critique. The monarchy no longer governs an empire, but its imprint, gentle and persistent, lingers in unexpected places, in school oaths, courtroom rituals, postage stamps, and the quiet cadence of tradition. So pause now beneath the imagined canopy of the imperial crown, a symbol once carried across deserts and oceans, whispered in prayers and printed on school books. The monarchy was never just a figurehead. It was a story, one of unity and distance, of loyalty and longing, of a shared identity that was always more complex than it seemed. As the centuries of empire recede into history, what remains behind are not only archives and artifacts, but questions. Questions about how to remember, what to honor, what to question, and what to let go. Across former colonies and within Britain itself, a quiet reckoning continues, unfolding in classrooms, public squares, museums, and family conversations. Memory, it turns out, is not just a reflection of the past, it is also a choice. And the legacy of the British Empire lives on in the decisions made about what is preserved, what is silenced, and what is retold. In cities across the United Kingdom, statues of colonial figures still stand, generals, governors, explorers, and merchants who once helped build and maintain the empire. Some are celebrated, others barely noticed, their plaques worn by weather and time. Yet in recent years, these monuments have become focal points for debate. Who do we honor? Whose histories are given space in public memory? The toppling of Edward Colston's statue in Bristol in 2020, for example, sparked international conversations about the role of slavery in Britain's prosperity and the ways in which its legacy has been remembered or forgotten. Museums, too, are at the center of this reflection. Institutions like the British Museum, the Victoria and Albert Museum, and countless university collections hold artifacts from around the world, many acquired during the height of empire. Sacred objects, cultural treasures, and even human remains were taken in the name of science, exploration, or spoil. Now communities and nations are asking for their return. The Benin bronzes, the Parthenon marbles, the treasures of Tipu Sultan, each item carries with it a history far deeper than its display case. Debates over restitution are not just about objects, but about dignity, sovereignty, and repair. Education is another frontier of memory. In former colonies, school curricula once centered on British history and perspectives. Over time, efforts have grown to decolonize education, to include local histories, oral traditions, resistance movements, and voices long excluded. In Britain, there are calls to teach more fully the realities of empire, its role in slavery, its impact on indigenous peoples, its enduring inequalities. These efforts seek not to rewrite history, but to tell it more completely, to acknowledge not only achievement, but consequence. Across the Commonwealth, memorials to empire remain part of the landscape. Cenotaphs honor colonial soldiers who died in distant wars. Street names recall governors and viceroys. Government buildings still bear royal insignia. In some places, these remnants are preserved as heritage. In others, they are challenged, reinterpreted, or removed. The decision to rename a street or rehouse a statue is often contentious, not simply about the past, but about identity, belonging, and the shape of national memory. The descendants of empire, in Britain, in the Caribbean, in Africa and Asia, carry their own memories, passed through generations. Stories of migration, service, struggle, and resilience live in family histories. For some, the empire is remembered with pride, a connection to a wider world, a time of opportunity. For others, it is recalled with pain, a source of loss, injustice, and silence. Most often, it is remembered with complexity, a mix of emotions shaped by personal experience and inherited legacy. In literature, film, and art, these memories find new expression. Post-colonial writers like Salman Rushdie, Andrea Levy, Chinua Achebe, and Arundhati Roy explore themes of identity, diaspora, and memory. Artists reinterpret imperial iconography, questioning what was glorified and what was hidden. Films examine colonial relationships, migration, and the long aftershocks of empire. These creative works help society engage with the past, not only through facts, but through feeling. Public ceremonies also shape how empire is remembered. Remembrance Day honors soldiers from across the empire, though their stories have not always been equally told. Commonwealth Day, royal jubilees, and state visits evoke images of shared heritage. Yet alongside celebration lies a quiet undercurrent, a recognition that shared history does not always mean shared experience. Memory is uneven, and reconciliation requires more than ceremony. As younger generations inherit the legacy of empire, they ask new questions. What does it mean to live in a post-imperial world? How do we honor our ancestors without repeating old hierarchies? What does justice look like when history cannot be changed? These are not questions with simple answers, but they mark the beginning of deeper understanding, a movement not toward forgetting, but toward a more honest, inclusive form of remembering. So let us pause here, in the stillness of museums and the shadow of statues, in pages of textbooks and the flicker of old films. The British Empire may no longer rule, but it is still present, in memory, in monuments, in the choices we make about how to carry the past. And in that quiet space between history and remembrance, we begin to find meaning. As the twilight of empire settled across the 20th century, nations emerged from its long shadow, not as replicas of Britain, but as distinct societies, each shaped by its own geography, culture, struggle, and sense of self. The end of formal colonial rule did not bring instant clarity. What followed instead was a slower, deeper process, the reimagining of who a people were, what their nation meant, and how to move forward from a shared yet unequal past. Independence brought flags and anthems, yes, but it also brought questions about language, land, leadership, and legacy. In the years following decolonization, countries across Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, and the Pacific faced the complex task of nation building. Many inherited colonial borders that ignored ethnic, linguistic, or religious differences. The state structures left behind were often centralized, legalistic, and modeled after British institutions. Civil services, militaries, and education systems bore the markings of empire, yet were now tasked with serving new sovereign aims. Leaders emerged, some democratically elected, others revolutionary, some authoritarian, each seeking to define their country's future in a rapidly changing world. Cultural identity became a central concern. Across the former empire, movements arose to reclaim indigenous languages, traditional dress, music, festivals, and oral histories. Writers and artists helped shape new national narratives, not simply rejecting British influence, but weaving together the old and the new. In Nigeria, Chinua Achebe wrote stories that placed African voices at the center of their own history. In India, filmmakers and poets explored post-colonial anxieties and pride. In the Caribbean, calypso and reggae gave sound to a people's joy, sorrow, and survival. In many countries, renaming became a symbolic first step toward reclamation. Cities, streets, and institutions once named for British monarchs or colonial officials were given local names. Ceylon became Sri Lanka, Rhodesia became Zimbabwe, Bombay became Mumbai. These changes were more than cosmetic. They marked a desire to center indigenous identity and history, to loosen the grip of a foreign narrative. Yet the process was often gradual, uneven, and contested. Some colonial legacies were retained for practicality or out of habit. Others were fiercely debated, even generations later. Education systems were restructured to reflect national histories, not just imperial ones. Textbooks were rewritten. New curricula were developed to celebrate local heroes, revolutions, and cultural achievements. Universities that once taught British literature as the gold standard now introduced post-colonial theory, local languages, and indigenous philosophies. In many countries, students were taught to see themselves not as former subjects, but as inheritors of rich, complex civilizations that had endured and adapted long before empire arrived. Economically, independence posed both challenge and opportunity. Many nations remained reliant on exports established during colonial rule: cocoa, tea, oil, minerals. Attempts at diversification and industrialization met with varied success. Global institutions like the IMF and World Bank offered support, often tied to strict policies. Some countries thrived, others struggled with corruption, conflict, or instability. Yet throughout it all, the pursuit of self-determination remained at the heart of national life, the desire not only to survive, but to flourish on one's own terms. Migration played an important role in shaping identity after empire. Diasporas formed by decades of labor movement, displacement, and settlement created bridges between former colonies and the metropole. London became home to vibrant communities from India, Nigeria, Jamaica, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. Toronto, Sydney, and Auckland followed similar paths. These global movements brought both connection and complexity, raising questions about multiculturalism, integration, and what it meant to belong in a world built by empire but no longer ruled by it. For the descendants of empire, identity became something layered. A young woman in Nairobi might speak both Swahili and English, listen to local radio and BBC News, celebrate traditional holidays and wear Western fashion. A man in Port of Spain might trace his ancestry to India but feel deeply Caribbean. A child in London might grow up hearing stories of a grandmother's village in Punjab or Kingston, blending memories of two worlds into one. Former colonies also became leaders on the world stage. India, the world's largest democracy, emerged as a regional power. South Africa, after decades of apartheid, itself a structure informed by colonial ideas, became a symbol of reconciliation and hope. Nations like Malaysia, Ghana, and Barbados navigated the post-colonial era with distinct strategies, forging partnerships beyond the old imperial web. The Commonwealth of Nations, while rooted in colonial history, became a forum for shared dialogue, an imperfect but evolving symbol of how connection might outlast control. And yet the journey was not without difficulty. Legacies of empire continued to shape debates over land, language, religion, and memory. Political divisions, economic disparities, and cultural tensions often traced their roots to decisions made long before independence. Healing took time, and in many places continues still. But the strength of these nations lay in their ability to adapt, to imagine futures beyond the constraints of history. Today, the post-imperial world is defined by plurality. Former colonies are not footnotes in Britain's story, they are authors of their own. Their literature, science, diplomacy, and culture enrich the global stage. Their resilience, creativity, and complexity challenge simplistic narratives about what it means to be developed or modern. They remind us that history is not destiny, and that out of the structures of empire can rise vibrant sovereign nations. So rest now in these reimagined spaces beneath new flags, in renamed cities, in classrooms filled with possibility. The end of empire was not an ending but a beginning, and from its remnants a world of many voices, many paths, and many futures continues to grow. Even as the British Empire has faded from political maps, its imprint remains etched into the structure of today's world. It lingers not just in memory or monument, but in the laws we follow, the languages we speak, the alliances we form, and the questions we continue to ask. Though the empire no longer rules, it quietly influences global systems, creating a web of continuity that reaches across continents and through generations. In these echoes, subtle but enduring, we begin to see how the legacy of empire still frames the present. Perhaps the most immediate legacy is language. English, once confined to the British Isles, is now a global lingua franca used in diplomacy, commerce, education, aviation, and science. It is spoken as a first language in former settler colonies and as a second or official language in many post-colonial nations. Across the globe, millions read, write, and speak in a tongue introduced through imperial classrooms. In doing so, they reshape it, infusing it with local idioms, accents, and rhythms. Nigerian English, Indian English, Caribbean patois, each reflects a world where English has been adapted, not just adopted. Legal systems also bear the mark of British rule. In dozens of countries, British common law continues to guide courts and constitutions. From Canada to Kenya, Australia to India, Legal frameworks established under empire remain central to how justice is administered. Parliamentary structures, with elected assemblies, prime ministers, and ceremonial heads of state, persist in many former colonies. While adapted to local contexts, these institutions reflect a political DNA inherited from British governance, offering both stability and ongoing debate over decolonization and reform. Education, too, carries traces of empire. University systems, exam formats, and school uniforms follow British models in many parts of the world. In some places, elite schools still teach British literature and history alongside national curricula. At the same time, there has been a global movement to re-examine these inherited systems, to broaden the curriculum, to include indigenous knowledge, and to question whose voices are heard in classrooms. The legacy is not static, but evolving, a conversation between past frameworks and present needs. On the global stage, international institutions reflect the uneven legacy of empire. The United Nations, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, though created after empire's decline, often operate within structures of power shaped during the colonial period. Former imperial powers, including Britain, hold significant influence. Trade routes, financial networks, and diplomatic norms retain elements of a world once divided between metropole and periphery. Efforts to redress global inequality, whether through development aid, climate negotiations, or reparations, are often tangled in this inherited landscape. Migration is another enduring thread. Diaspora communities continue to link former colonies to Britain, culturally, economically, and emotionally. Remittances flow from London to Lagos, Toronto to Dhaka. Families are spread across oceans, holding passports from different nations but sharing a common lineage. Immigration laws, citizenship debates, and multicultural policies in the UK are still shaped by its imperial past, as are the identities of its people, many of whom carry both the privileges and burdens of dual heritage. Cultural influence also flows in both directions. British television, literature and sports, especially football and cricket, are consumed across the former empire. Meanwhile, music, food and art from former colonies have become integral to British identity. London, Birmingham, Manchester, these are now cities of the world where sounds of the Caribbean, South Asia, and Africa blend into the rhythm of everyday life. Empire once claimed to export culture, now it is enriched by the cultures it once tried to control. Debates over history and memory continue to shape national conversations. In Britain, questions about what is taught in schools, what is celebrated in public life, and how to address colonial violence remain pressing. In former colonies, similar questions arise: how to honor ancestors, how to balance inheritance and innovation, how to navigate relationships with former imperial powers. These are not simply academic debates, they speak to how people understand their place in the world and how nations frame their stories. Even language itself carries traces of empire. Words like bungalow, loot, khaki and pajamas, now commonplace in English, originated from colonial contact. Architectural styles, administrative vocabulary, and ceremonial customs often blend British forms with local adaptation. Weddings, uniforms, parliamentary procedures, all may bear subtle signs of imperial legacy, carried forward sometimes unconsciously, sometimes deliberately, into the present day. And yet, this legacy is not fixed. It is questioned, reinterpreted, and reshaped with every generation. Activists, scholars, artists, and citizens across the world engage critically with empire's inheritance. Some seek justice for historical wrongs. Others aim to recover silenced histories or reclaim erased identities. New nations assert their own narratives, distinct from the ones imposed by empire, and in doing so, contribute to a broader, more honest global memory. So pause now and listen, not to the loud declarations of empire's rise, but to its quiet persistence in everyday life. In city names and legal terms, in school books and songs, in migrations and memories. The British Empire may be over, but its legacy lives in the very structure of the modern world, a world still reckoning with how it came to be. And so we arrive at the end of this long, quiet journey, a path that has wandered through time and tide, across continents and centuries, through the ports, plantations, schools, and palaces that once formed the wide and tangled net of the British Empire. We have followed the rise of a small island kingdom as it stretched outward across the world, shaping laws and landscapes, moving people and power, and leaving behind traces in every corner of the globe. Now, in the stillness of this final chapter, we pause, not to close the book, but to gently fold it, carrying its weight with softness and reflection. The British Empire was never just a singular event, nor a single story. It was a web, vast, shifting, and layered, built over generations by ambition, belief, violence, hope, and contradiction. Its architects were kings and clerks, sailors and surveyors. Its laborers were countless, enslaved and indentured, recruited and resisting. Its legacy is one of remarkable achievements and profound injustices, of connections forged and cultures uprooted, of cities built and silences imposed. To understand empire is to acknowledge this complexity, to sit, unhurried, with its grandeur and its grief, its order and its disruption. History does not demand that we choose between celebration or condemnation. Rather, it invites us to see clearly, to recognize the full sweep of events and their consequences, to honor those who endured and those who resisted, and to listen for the voices that history once tried to quiet. In doing so, we find not only facts, but understanding. We find a way to move forward with humility. In the former colonies, the empire's remnants live in stone and story, in parliaments that debate new futures, in museums that return old treasures, in poems written in languages once imposed but now lovingly claimed. In Britain, its legacy lives in its streets and schools, in its diverse communities, in the daily blend of cultures that shape what it means to be British today. The empire may no longer govern, but its imprint remains, not as command, but as memory. And memory, like the tide, does not stay still. It rises, returns, recedes, reshapes. The monuments may stand or fall, the debates may continue, but the work of remembrance, honest, compassionate, thoughtful, endures. For in remembering with care, we give meaning to the lives behind the statistics, the names behind the treaties, the stories that never made the textbooks but lived in the hearts of millions. Let us end not with judgment, but with gentleness. Let us remember that history is a shared space, shaped by all who lived within it, and by all of us who seek to understand it. The story of the British Empire is vast, but it is not endless. It belongs to the past, even as its echoes live on. And now, with quiet minds and softened thoughts, we close this chapter, not in haste but in peace. May your thoughts settle softly here, where the sails have furled, the books are shelved, and the long journey rests beneath a quiet sky. The empire has passed, but the stories and the lessons they carry remain.